foreign policy think tank to like bloggers.
All right, you
I
guys,
went,
you guys are live now, by the way. But
oh,
but
good,
just
good.
1 second, and I just want to test this really quickly.
Then I do not need to record, right? Is that you have that right?
Uh, yes, I don't think that. All right, you guys are live now, by the way. But
Oh,
but
good,
just
good.
1 second, and I just want to. Huh.
Then I do not need to record, right? Is that you have that right?
Okay, you guys are good. So I guess I'm only here for technical reasons, so you guys do whatever you got to do. All right.
Awesome. I'm here
Yep.
for technical and emotional reasons.
Cool.
Okay, we're 1 minute in, and I figure we get started. We may have some more folks shuffle into the actual room as we go, but we're also live streaming, so I thought we get started. Quick introductions, and then I've got to start off with a question, and we'll just take it from there and see where the conversation goes. So, welcome everybody, both in the room and on the live stream. I'm Sean Patrick Hughes, and today we're going to have a discussion about the future of American foreign policy and the way ahead. Joining us is Alex Ward, who is an award-winning Pulitzer Prize finalist national security reporter for Politico. He's also the author of a new book called The Internationalists, The Fight to Restore American Foreign Policy After Trump. I had to read it. It's a long subtitle in there, but it's a book I've read. I really enjoyed it. Alex, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. And yeah, I continued the trend of subtitles being far longer than their actual titles. I don't know why this is the trend of the book industry, but I've contributed to the problem.
Well, I enjoyed the book. I read it. I didn't do the thing where we talk about a book I didn't read, but I had it very refreshing from a perspective, as I thought it was very straightforward. It was an account. It was somewhat dispassionate, which may not sound like what most readers want, but kind of what I'm looking for out of a book on the topic. And I'll throw out kind of a pretty big sweeping question, and we'll probably get narrower as we go. But the question for me is, from your perspective, what's the core difference between the Trump and Biden foreign policy?
And the core difference, I think, is, well, there's the macro and then there's the semi-macro. And the macro is, they are both internationalists, but Trump's version of internationalism is far different than Biden's. And it is a nationalist internationalism, if we want to even call it that. And I'm sure some academic will slap me down for saying something like that. But basically, whereas Biden believes in alliances, small d democratic values promotion, free trade, although that's being curtailed to a certain extent, that's all well and good. It follows the through line from 1945, Republican and Democratic administrations, basically through now. Trump is an aberration from it, and he red teamed it right in his first term. I think still more than expected. Followed the rules, because he was kind of kept there, bounded there. He definitely stress tested them, but he mostly stayed within those lines. And then is expected to break out of them if he gets another shot. So I think generally speaking, one of the things I was really interested in when I started writing the book was originally supposed to be basically Trump divided and just what the transition would be, and Trump being an aberration, and here's the avatar for traditional American foreign policy. How's that going to go? And I was sort of interested in just that question, and then it turned into a bigger thing because of Afghanistan and Ukraine. But it's to me, if we're considering that post 1945 rubric, a Biden is like 90% there now, and he's changing in part because of I would say most of the international trade stuff. That's different. Trump would be very different. So it would define, or at least try to usher in a new version of American internationalism, which is far different than the one we've had. So that's the macro one. The minor one is something I've alluded to already, which is how you work with allies. I mean, Biden, for better or worse, has tied very closely with the actions of allies, right? I mean, in In some cases, you can say for worse, like, sorry, Germany, about the way Trump treated you. Here's a Russian pipeline, right? Or for good in the way that they've defended Ukraine. Trump doesn't, I mean, he sees allies in the sense of who is doing stuff that benefits the United States. Now that may be what we need in this era, right? Maybe there needs to be a course correction. That's for smart people to me to decide. But that's how I think that would be different, is, well, where Biden will give up a little bit of American interest, let's say, for the longer term, where working with allies can be helpful when the big things arise. That's not to say that, he's giving up American sovereignty or anything. It's just there are moments where it is better to make allies happy that don't necessarily make America happy. Trump doesn't see it that way. He goes, if they're not working for me, it's with me or against me, with us or against us. So that's I think going to be one of the main early differences. And of course, this leads into the questions about NATO, et cetera, which we all know.
So, and from a hygiene perspective, I have the chat open. So if anybody has any questions or just wants to chime in, anybody on the call is free. It's better if it's a discussion. I think what I thought was pretty interesting, and I think I expected it, but to actually get into the machinations of it inside from a staff perspective, when you read the accounts and you read the commentary that you highlight in the book, is that one of the realizations that Trump had come to that Biden has not moved off of, but I think is substantially different than Obama, is that the idea of kind of nation building and engagement with the middle class of other countries and an eventual movement into kind of liberal democracy. If you build the alliances and you build the free trade and you build the aid, eventually they just move into a space where we have an ally in a liberal democracy, and it's somebody who's on our team versus the other space. And I think that we had great reason to believe over the last 30 years that there's a lot of flaws in that, and we've had our shared nation building. I've been a part of probably more than I cared to be. What I thought was interesting is the America First vision of Trump is echoed a little bit in what you hear from Jake Sullivan, especially at the end of that, and the epilogue of your book has a really great speech that he references, and I've thought about that speech a lot over the time since he gave it, that it is about America foreign policy for Americans, which is really close to America First, but not quite. It'd be interesting to get your perspective on that.
Well, I've been not shy in saying a couple of things. One is that a foreign policy for the middle class, right, this moniker that Team Biden gives to everything they do, is just liberal Trumpism, right? They're trying to rebrand it, or at least, let's take the sort of seminal moment that kicked all this off, right? Jake Sullivan is next to Hillary Clinton as she's conceding to Trump. Like, this is a guy who grew up in the middle class in Minnesota, and even though he went to Yale Law School and all that, like, still sees himself as a middle class kid that made it, right? So he got out-populisted, out-middle class by a New York real estate billionaire magnate. So how did that happen? So he spends 4 years, right, trying to figure out what they can do, and basically what he comes up with is like, let's just steal a little bit of that Trump stuff and fit it into Democratic framework. So let's not be shy about this. Like the Biden framework of foreign policy and even some of the domestic politics are born from the trauma of losing to Trump. Like this is a reaction, like a visceral reaction to holy shit, like we lost. We need like this notion. And I'll put it this way, like if you're Jake. Trump didn't necessarily win because of his foreign policy views, right? No president really does, although we can have that discussion. But Trump didn't lose because of them either, right? And he was saying stuff like, maybe we should get rid of NATO or we get out of it, and who or why would we help these people, and let's just bash China and whatever. Like, people voted for that. They still pulled the lever for that. Again, not maybe the main reason, but that was a reason. So they needed, in this era, if you are going to compete with him, you needed to fight on his turf to a certain extent, and this is the way they did so. So there's no question that foreign policy for the middle class is just America First rebranded in some sense. I mean, it is not doesn't have, the historical allusions or the more nativist connotations, and it certainly isn't, geared towards like immigration and things like that. Although Biden did adopt a lot of the restrictionist Trump immigration policies, but it is meant to say, or at least signal that era where America just kind of gives and gives and gives and gives, we're done with that. What's going to matter most to the way we conduct foreign policy is finding a way to make sure that you, the American, benefit. And if we can't sell that to you, and I use sell on purpose, right? Because there's a lot of political messaging here. And if we can't sell that to you, then it's probably not a policy we should pursue. That there has to be a way to actually make this case. So at risk of going on, like here's one very clear example. I happened to be on that Biden trip with MBS in Saudi Arabia, right, with the famous fist bump, right? So never go to Jeddah in July, by the way. It's just too hot. But anyway.
I know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm sure you do. So it's just too hot. Anyway. Yeah, we weren't there because of oil or energy, right? We were there for many other reasons, for China. China was making inroads, and we wanted to counter Iran, and we, it was better for us to have Saudi on our side, so we did the Abraham Accords. But it wasn't, it was not about oil either, because OPEC was messing around at the time, and prices were going up. And look, I was having conversations on the sideline with Biden administration officials who, they ran down that list before, and they said, well, what's more foreign policy for the middle class than lower gas prices? And so then you get the contradiction of you defend Ukraine, you defend Ukraine, you defend Ukraine, all well and good, and they have their own middle class reasons for that. But because it's sanctions on Russia, et cetera, prices go up. So it's not like a blanket statement, and of course there's going to be contradictions throughout. But their main argument holds that they have to find a way to make a middle class argument, and instead of lower oil prices or energy prices for Ukraine, it is better to not send American sons and daughters to go fight there. You got to stop Russia there, et cetera. Otherwise, and then on top of that, most of the weapons authorization that we send or that go through Congress, that ends up being jobs in the United States. So they're basically selling it as a jobs program now. So anyway, I went on too long, but all this to say is that you're like, if any of that sounded Trumpian to you, it's because it is. Like that was by design.
So and that was something I was thinking through and through the book. Like you kind of there's a bit of permission giving to think about it that way, which I thought was really astute. There's an interesting book by a former Portuguese diplomat, Bruno Machado, who you may or may not have read it. I'm sure you're familiar with either some version of his work, and it's the Dawn of Eurasia, and book's a couple of years old, and kind of the core thesis in it is that the slow progression of everything towards liberal democracy is kind of a flawed view, very similar to what you're hearing from Trump and now the Biden administration, as you point out. And that the way like that, it was just going to happen that way. It was a heavy flaw of the Obama and Clinton eras, and Bush as well, last 30 years. And that we were moving into a world of interconnected competition. Supply chains were the goal, cyber wars, other things. But what he didn't really talk too much about, because if you think 2018, 2017 timeframe, the idea of modern countries fighting each other in a shooting war still pretty far. It hadn't happened in a long, long time, at scale at least. And then with the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, my initial thought was that that was wrong. It's not a battle of supply chains. It's a battle of regional influence, and we're back in the 19th century, or the first half of the 20th century, which actually turned out to be wrong again. And I think your book does a great job of talking through the supply chain and the pipelines in those areas. I actually had a chance to ask Bruno about, like, would he change his thesis based on what he's observed in the last 2 years? And he said, absolutely not. All this is expanding the competition, which was never off the table to begin with, to actual military action. But the war, like, here we are. It's all about supply chains all over again. It's just the context is there's a live war happening between two developed technologically advanced countries. And then you actually start to realize that the 50, 75 years of globalization that has come after that hasn't made us immune from that. The old, we don't go to war with countries with a McDonald's, throw that out the window. History is not over. History, like, we're just in a world of acceleration in these areas. And I thought that was an interesting point that you had. And I hadn't thought if you'd thought about it, what you thought before the invasion of Ukraine versus after, because I know you were working through the book on both sides of it. How has that changed your perspective?
I mean, we saw the Russian troops outside of Ukraine that April, right? Like just 10 months before they went in. So the question at the time wasn't like supply chains. It was like, well, is this real or not? And at April time frame, it was, no, it's a bluff. But they never went home, really. And so that was always kind of out there. And then it comes after Afghanistan, where it becomes clear that what the intention is. Look, I could expand upon that thesis a bit more. Now I'm just kind of spitballing a little bit. Like this is a fight about the future, right? And not necessarily about values or ideology, although there is a bit of that. It can be a poly crisis. It can be about all the things, right? It can be everything everywhere all at once. Sorry to use that, but like it can be about systems of government. It can be about who has control over the technologies that will matter most in the future. It can be about who is gaining, who has the best stuff to make those technologies. It can be about who's getting the best workers in those technologies. It can be about who's advancing in green tech and who's going to have, if anything's going to save us from climate. Like, is someone going to create the great vacuum, right? And like that country all of a sudden wins, I don't know. But like, what the interesting thing is, we're seeing the seeds of that from the Trump years, right? Where it was just kind of like, screw you, China. Here's some tariffs. The good stuff's for us now. And then COVID hits, and everyone realizes, this is now really a scramble for resources. And then the Biden team comes in and goes, yeah, well, actually, our competition with China is, of course, about deterring something that happened in Taiwan, stopping aggression against our allies and our partners. But it is also keeping those sensitive technologies out of their military. It is also about beating them in green tech. It is also about beating their economy in general. It is about, advancing the industries of the future. And that is a competition. That is foreign policy now. Like, maybe it always was, but we don't really consider it that strongly. No agency has had a better glow up than the Bureau of Industry and Security and Commerce, right? They're the hotness now, right? Export, blacklists and export controls and whatever. Like, when they put out a new thing, you're like, ooh, who are they hitting now? So they are now not a new tool, but a more prominent tool of our foreign policy. And I think, one of the Biden's team's innovations is too strong, but emphasis was basically grabbing that element of the Trump's China policy and expanding it to China and beyond, and plus adding allies, right? I remember being on a February 2021 call, which I cite in the book, in which, the Biden administration officials were talking to reporters, and it was about to be like their big China review. They'd done their China review, and we're like, oh man, get ready for the new thing. And they were like, well, it's kind of what Trump did, actually, but let's bring allies in. And meaning, if we're going to put tariffs on China, let's do that in coordination. If we're going to restrict certain technologies, let's do that in coordination, because if you have multiple actors, that makes it stronger. But that's really the innovation. Like, that's it. Outside of that, it's mostly the Trump play. Although, and I don't want to discount the fact that Biden's team is very open about wanting to have diplomatic talks in pretty much every issue area in order to keep tensions as low as possible. But they've totally ramped up other issues, including the Quad, which really ramped up under Trump, but et cetera, et cetera. I mean, basically, the China policy, like in this, is just what Trump did, ramp it up with allies. And I would imagine that would obviously continue in a second Biden term in some way. And if Trump comes back, I struggle to think that he would throw out, why do we need our allies working with us? Like, I think he would just sort of inherit that. That might just be on autopilot. And so you would almost see like a seesaw of Trump to Biden to Trump again, where it would mostly stay the same.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what the mechanics of throwing out the alliances would be in the midst of the war in Ukraine as well. Like there's almost a path dependency. You can't get out of there. But the other thing to think about, like we're thinking about the utility of democracy, not to get too far up into the clouds, but this is actually somewhat how it's supposed to work, in that the substantial pivot in 2016 has stuck a little bit in the areas that it was very clear that the space had been opened up by departing from, like, and we think about, I mean, decades of a stagnant strategy, that when we were in decades-long wars, we were rechurning and re-electing some version of the same people with the same policies. And I actually thought what was really interesting is that, Obama, from the Obama administration to Biden, there's actually more difference between those two than there is between the Trump and Biden administration.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. I mean, obviously there's similarities. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, for sure.
But like, it really was. The interesting thing about this team is they all learned a lot of lessons from Obama. And one of the big ones, speaking of trauma, was, Crimea was taken on our watch, and they didn't really respond. I mean, I think the record shows that. Like, yes, there were sanctions, yes, there were condemnations, but to what end? I mean, it really amounted to very little. So basically, the moment the Russians start putting troops on Ukraine's border, the Jake Sullivans, the John Feiners, the Antony Blinkens, the whatever, they just start going, red light, red light, red light. They really want to push back on this, but even just beyond that, so there's those elements that are different on a hawkish level from Obama, and then there are just the similarities on economics, especially, and on China with Trump. So it's just there's and actually even on the hawkish stuff, quote unquote, on Ukraine, like Trump the man was particularly friendly with Putin, with Russia. Trump the government, the administration, was very harsh on Russia. They're the ones who sent defensive weapons to Ukraine. They're the ones who sanctioned Russia over the killing of Skripals and whatnot. Like, yes, I understand what Trump said and did with Russia. Like, I get that. But his administration really set the foundation for Biden's team to be able to hit Russia even harder. So, even on some of the hawkish stuff, quote unquote, Biden and Trump are very similar.
Yeah, that was my take on your take. Anybody has any questions, just open up. I don't want to throw it out and put anybody on the spot. So either in the chat or just speak up, unmute. We're here. The shifting a little bit into the very early portion of the Biden administration, the earliest, and something that I paid a lot of attention to and spent a good part of my time in service supporting the end of Afghanistan, so the withdrawal. There's two thoughts that I had in what you wrote, and I hadn't actually thought. Part of it is I hadn't thought about it for like 2 years, honestly. I thought quite a bit about it when it happened, and I hadn't thought about it for about 2 years, which I think may have been a little bit by design. What was really clear in your account was how much Biden, like President Biden, the man himself, was committed to leaving Afghanistan, and how much that drove the decision, almost come what may. And now the other thought is 2 years later, 2 to 3 years later, I don't know how many Americans you could find that wish we were still there, despite at the time, the towering embarrassment, and certainly, as a OEF and OIF veteran, many of my old friends and teammates were beside themselves about dishonoring what we'd done. Well, meanwhile, while we were there, we used to wonder aloud why we were there. And disclaimer, I was never boots on the ground in Afghanistan. I had teams that reported to me that were there. My boots on the ground was entirely in Iraq. I just want you run some risk if you confuse people on that. So is that, did I read that right? It was really Biden himself driving the commitment to exit, or am I overstating that?
No, it's totally right. Look, Biden wanted out. That was clear. They did do a review, and to the administration writ large's credit, right? They did do a review. Now, you talk to anyone now about it, and they'll go, "Well, we kind of all knew what the conclusion was going to be." But let's consider the fact, and let's look back at the Trump years and Obama years. Anytime DOD, and it was usually DOD advocating to continue. Whenever they advocated that, and the president went against it, that's both Obama and Trump. They went to the press. They said, no, we offered this amount, that we need to surge X amount of troops. We need to do XYZ things. The president's making a strategic mistake here. Come Biden, they spent 4 months having this discussion. Biden makes the decision, and nothing comes out of DOD until after the failure of the withdrawal. But the reason is, and you got to give the administration credit, and by that I really mean the White House, credit for, they made the Pentagon feel heard. They're like, we get that you want to stay, right? They were advocating 2,500 to 3,500 troops.
Right.
Okay. So what is the plan for victory with that number? And for 2 to 4 months, basically, DOD was providing XYZ plans. Biden would read them and go, that doesn't make sense to me. Right? So, yes, he was inclined to leave, but he was willing to listen. And even when Secretary of State Antony Blinken went to Europe and was like, hey, we're thinking of leaving, and they freaked out, right? Because they didn't necessarily want to leave. They had been involved in this war too. Blinken tells Biden, and Biden goes, okay, write up a memo, tell me what our allies think, and maybe I'll consider staying, etc. So, he was open to the idea. And everyone I talked to said as much. That Biden himself and the team at large was open to the idea of staying. But with the caveat of Biden's inclined to leave, so you have to convince him to stay. And no one could. And my conclusion is it wasn't like he was intransigent, although it's clear what he wanted. But if someone had presented to him a paper that said, if you keep 3,500 troops, you can win here by this date, he might have done it. But I think we can all agree, even if you're not a military expert, 3,500 troops to somehow bring democracy to Afghanistan just wasn't going to happen, so he decided to leave. And I think what you said at the start was very astute. Everyone could be upset with how we left. And I think my book makes clear that we left pretty disastrously. But it is the how, not the what, right? No one is saying, man, it'd be really great. I mean, that's not true. Some people are saying it. But most people are not advocating for that war to go beyond its 20th year. So the issue really comes down to one of competence, which was, we're the United States, damn it. And Biden promised not to, have people leaving off helicopters off of hotel roofs. And yet that's kind of what we saw, right? And here we are letting the Taliban basically decide who gets through the first ring into Kabul airport. Right. And here we are giving them lists and manifests of people so they can do a checkpoint and let people go through. And here we are basically ceding Kabul to them. And here we are, after the intelligence said it would take 18 to 24 months to take over the whole of the country, they're in charge in 11 days. All of that speaks to what the hell happened here. This team was supposed to be the adults, right? They were supposed to be the A team. They're supposed to bring back some confidence to American government after Trump. And nothing exemplifies failure more than what happened in Afghanistan. But even to this day, Biden would say, he didn't want anyone to resign. He didn't ask anyone to resign. He was still very pleased, generally speaking, with the decision to leave and the fact that we're out. And if you talk to the team today, they'll say, look, with all this stuff going on in the world, do you really want us to spend more time and resources in Afghanistan? No. They think it was the right strategic decision. But, at risk of sounding military myself, although I'm not, on the tactical level, the actual maneuvers of how we left, and we can question Bagram, et cetera, all we want, but airport, all that was pretty disastrous.
And I think go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Well, I think when you get down to it, at the end, we were in the land of bad ideas tactically. But if you go upstream of that, I think time has proven that there was already a dead hand, in that the speed at which the forces that we supported and asked to take up the fight in our after we've left fell. Kind of, at what point would that not have been the case? 25 years, 30 years, I don't think we were. It's likely we were. My 2 cents. Likely we were at the point of diminishing returns, and it takes us back to the spot where you should probably do it the first year of your administration, because everybody's going to forget about the worst parts of it by the end of it. And I think that's kind of what has happened, and from an electorate perspective.
Yeah.
Certainly not for people who serve there or others, but that's kind of understood.
That may be true. I mean, we shouldn't discount the fact that Trump did sign a deal with the Taliban, right? And that started the clock for the decision on whether to withdraw or not. And one of the things that Biden said that actually struck me at the time, he said, "Look, I'm a steward of the U.S. government, and our government made a deal, and I, in some way, have to honor that deal, whether I agree with it or not." And I thought, I don't know if that was a cop-out or not, but there's a part of me that, a guy who's so institutional and has been in D.C. for so long, there's a part of me that's kind of like, I bet that there's a part of him that actually feels that way. He doesn't have to agree with the decision necessarily, although I think he did overall. But he was like, hey, the U.S. government made a deal. We can't go back on our word. That doesn't help anybody. But yeah, I think your electoral point is probably fair. Although I think we should note that Biden's numbers plummeted after Afghanistan.
Yeah,
and they haven't really recovered. And again, I think it just goes back to the point of everything about Biden and his team was sold on the adults are back, America is back, and it didn't look like we were back during that whole ordeal.
And my disclaimer too is that I'm wrong about every election, so I'm not in the numbers game for that. Just kind of more of a anecdotal observation. I think what was also a continuing theme in your book was the hole that the U.S. had to dig out of from a reputation perspective that had started long before the withdrawal of Afghanistan, back to the weapons of mass destruction in the original invasion of Iraq in 2003. If we fast forward into the intelligence apparatus around Ukraine, what I also found, there's two things that I thought were really interesting. And the first was that we were having trouble getting people to believe us about what was likely to happen. And I don't mean the American public. I mean the heads of state, Zelensky himself, which I thought I hadn't heard that previously, and it was pretty shocking to see that we were trying to convince even the executive branch of Ukraine that they were in imminent danger. I don't know how much of that was posturing. Probably never know. I don't know. But the other part, though, is along with that, we were still coordinating and using our relationships with allies so that once the tanks roll across the eastern border of Ukraine, everybody's at least on the same page as what has happened, and we're not caught completely flat-footed. So it's this weird dynamic of nobody's believing us, but they're kind of believing us a little bit, because when things happened, we moved fairly swiftly with the sanctions, and I know we stopped the building of the pipeline. Am I thinking about that right?
I mean, yeah. Look, first of all, what an intelligence get! Holy crap! Like it was pretty remarkable. But no, I mean, I think one of the newsier elements of the book, and I was surprised, and this book received some coverage, not a lot, from news media, my colleagues, but I was surprised the thing that didn't get picked up as much was just how bad the Biden-Zelensky relationship was. I mean,
right.
It was screaming match bad, right? I mean, I think we sort of knew, if you were following the stories at the time, like we knew Biden and Zelensky weren't on the same page about everything, because of course Ukraine wanted all the weapons up front, and Biden was being kind of cautious and trying to still make some sort of, to dissuade the Russians from invading diplomatically, whatever. That we can have that discussion about whether that was wise or not. So like Zelensky's like, screw you, dude. You're not helping me. And on top of that, you keep saying the Russians are going to invade, and they're not. Like, they're just not going to do it. They're not that stupid. We, the Ukrainians, don't have that intelligence. And, we can have a whole discussion as well about why maybe the Ukrainian intelligence didn't get that. And, like, it led to just a really tense relationship, to the point that on certain phone calls, Biden's looking around the room like, what do I have to do to make this guy, like, prepare for what's to come? right? And the interesting thing is that there were our European allies too were not overly convinced. The Brits were like, "Yep, we're good. We've got that intel too. Like we're good." The French called it wrong. Famously called it wrong. Their military intel chief was fired over it because he said there was nothing. The Germans were skeptical, but of course that I think had to do in part with their politics. Right, Angela Merkel was leaving. Olaf Scholz was going to start coming in, and we sort of getting the sense that his coalition would be weak. So that was part of it. But it took some convincing, and it took like our director of national intelligence, our CIA director, our defense secretary, our secretary of state, all had to go over there and be like, here it is. Here, and look at it. And then they went, oh, all right. Like, this is real. So now the interesting thing beyond that is even we in the media were skeptical somewhat, in part because it feels weird for Putin to want to do this. And also, we, the media, have been burned before by a government putting out intel and, about a war. And people were pretty skeptical. Like, okay, well, can we see the intel? No, you can't see the intel. And we're like, all right, well, that feels sketchy. And then they kind of set a line that put a lot of reporters at ease, which was, look, we're putting out this intel not to start a war, but to stop one. Right, which I thought actually was fairly astute. And I'm not one to usually give credence to a government. It's my job. I'm paid to be skeptic. But in that case, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? That they were trying to pre-bunk what the Russians were saying. They were trying to counter-program whatever they were going to do with the blood bags and the dead bodies, right? Which, if you have information, you can do that without burning sources and methods. Why not? Like, I feel like that was a fairly strong move on their part. So
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm talking too much. Please keep cutting me off.
No, I will. No, I'm kidding. As a military experienced person, what I thought was interesting is the difference between the evaluation of performance versus the evaluation of the anticipation of action are actually two very different things. And if we were people were comparing, like, we got it dead wrong in Afghanistan, how could we get it right in Russia and Eastern Europe? Well, you're evaluating two very different things. It's all under the auspices of intelligence. But one is who's going to win the game. The other one is there going to be a game played? And in modern technology and satellite imagery and signals intelligence, and the fact that Russia is not a space we have not invested in from an intelligence perspective over the last 100 years. One of those is way easier to figure out than the other. Because in one, you're predicting the unpredictable. You really never know what's going to happen once the shooting happens. And what happened in Ukraine is very different than what we like. The thing that was consistent is we didn't know how the Afghans were going to hold up, and we didn't know how Ukraine was going to hold up. We had assessments of weeks before the entire government was out. But what was interesting is you had a quote from Milley in there, and I've heard it before, was about, you'll be in there in 14 days, and you're going to spend 14 years there and lose 14,000 troops. And that's just how it's going to be. We know that. And so that, like, if we transition into the future, that's the end of it. The end of it can't possibly look different than the ends that we've tried to pursue when we've done it. And my anecdotal experience is we had a family from Ukraine that stayed with us. They were refugees. They were leaving. We had them stay with us for a couple of days because I live down on the southern border of the U.S. And so we were able to bring them across legally. They stayed with us while they transitioned their pace, and they flew. And they were, aside from language barriers, from a values and qualities of life and like career, indecipherable from us. And the idea that a population that yields that was going to transition into quasi-Soviet Russia seamlessly, and you'd be able to wander away and forget about it, seemed insanely unlikely. So that's all lots of words to say. I have really no idea how it ends. Fairly certain it doesn't end quickly, or if it does, it's because Russia's just decided to stop.
No, well said. I think that's right. It's interesting, one of the after Afghanistan, but also after the Ukraine, the very good Ukrainian repel of Russia. It was Bill Burns, the CIA director, who came out and he said, "Look, it turns out that we're pretty good in intelligence in general, but the one thing we're struggling with is like what's in the heart of the fighter. We're struggling to understand the will of people defending their nations, and in Afghanistan, we overestimated their will to fight. Now, granted, we could have an argument about that because we sort of knew, even though we've trained the Afghans for years, they weren't a particularly amazing fighting force. So I don't want to denigrate the many great fighters there. And we also knew they didn't really have a government truly worth fighting for. Right? I mean, I don't want to also denigrate great public servants in Kabul, but Ghani, that government's influence didn't extend too much further out beyond Kabul. So you take those two things together and you go, okay, well, that's going to hinder a response. But it's also possible that after that many years, they fight the Taliban. But still, we didn't call that part right. And there are other intel failures before that I covered in the book. But that part, I think, is important. With Ukraine, we underestimated their will to fight. Right? I mean, there were assessments. It was not the only one, but assessments that Russia would basically be in Kyiv in 72 hours and kill Zelensky, and they'd be in charge. And we didn't. And I'm sure this assessment came in part because Biden's literally trying to get Zelensky to defend his nation on the phone, right? But clearly there were preparations in the back. They were getting ready for what was to come, and maybe they quietly were seeing things. And they've done very well. With what they've been given, they've done very, very well. It's unclear that even if they get the $60 billion, aid package, that they'll win, but they'll most likely be able to hold their lines. So it's all this to say is, Bill Burns has some work to do, and the CIA and our intel agencies have to figure out, okay, it's not just who has what and when is that happening. It is when, it's gun versus gun, who's going to tough it out, who actually wants to fight, period. And actually, I should also say, we overestimated the will to fight of the Russians.
Right. It ebb and flow. I would have thought that, and I don't know why I would have thought this, 1,000 years of history tells us different, that the amount of casualties and impact that was suffered in the first few months would have made them change perspectives. But
oh yeah,
that ignores a lot of history. It's not generally how it goes for them.
That, and also the fact that they were on Ukraine's border for 10 months with like limited rotations out. I mean, that would kill the morale of almost any soldier, right? And cold, and they don't have clear command. It's just chaos. It's a one long camping trip, unfortunately. So one muddy, long, cold camping trip. So we got some work to do on that.
I also think it's interesting that the adage of you always the strategy and the build up is always about fighting the last war, and then the next war emerges from the conflict itself, and how supply chains and weapon systems and other things in a world of drone warfare and other things that we hadn't anticipated. It's just different. It's different. You need a smaller thumb to put on the scale potentially to matter more than it used to. And I think we're learning that many times over in a lot of different regions, which is a different, like transitioning into the conflict in Gaza. This is another space where it actually seems that it's hard to get through into what the core policy of the U.S. is. I think that there's a strong commitment towards Israel as an ally that comes from the president himself, at least his stated intent, and then another policy or process of putting demands and requirements in the shadows. And I think we're kind of at an interesting space where that works in a lot of ways, but it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out for a Democratic presidential candidate circa 2024. And is it right to say that he is that the driving force behind the stated policy is the president's commitment to Israel. But is it also right to assume that there's much more going on underneath the hood than we understand in how do we address the humanitarian crisis? How do we address the fallout for what is turning out to be a pretty brutal campaign?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. Yeah, this is from Biden. Like, this is I mean, if you want to find my pieces on Biden and his Israel history, feel free. But he's like, it's a 50-year history of being among the most staunchly pro-Israel democratic lawmakers, if not the most, and one of the ones, among the most, period. So this is where he comes from. I was, again, I mentioned me being in Jeddah in July. Before that was Jerusalem, right before. And I had never traveled with Biden in Israel before, and now, like, you could sense how happy he was to be there, how much he loved the country, how much he calls himself a Zionist, right? If Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. Like, those are lines, but they are also what he believes. So it did not surprise that, when October 7th happened, and let's not gloss over the fact that attack was horrific, right? And all that happened, and Israel understandably wanted and needed to defend itself from that and respond. So Biden, goes and says, yes, this is a terrible thing that's happened in Israel. Like, go forth. But to a point you were making earlier, we've made mistakes in this realm too when we sought revenge, and don't make those mistakes. And the Israelis didn't really heed that warning. And you talk to the administration now, and they'll say, well, we talked about the humanitarian stuff from the beginning. It's true. They mentioned it, but it wasn't a priority. The priority was, what can we do to help Israel defend itself? Correlation isn't causation, but once those uncommitted votes started rolling in, they started talking a lot more about the humanitarian stuff. Now, the interesting conundrum here is that broad polls of Americans show that they support Biden's policy, right? There are, of course, pockets that say we should care more about the Palestinians, all well and good. But overall, the average American is like, yeah, support Israel. We're with you. But it's the people that Biden needs to win that are speaking the loudest and
right.
Therefore causing the change. And so he's in this weird bind where not only is his Israel policy contradictory, right? Sell weapons to the Israelis that we then sort of lambast them for using on Palestinians. It is also, how do you support a policy of defending Israel while also being constantly asked in the press to criticize Israel and needing to? Like, it's a tough line for them to walk, and it's going to naturally lead to just muddle. And just lots and lots of muddle. And I think that's where we're at. And we're not even touching upon, of course, just the general devastation and horror in Gaza, but born from, of course, Hamas's attack. So it's like also one of those, everyone came into this conflict with their sides already, and this conflict just seems primed to push everyone to just make those cases even stronger. And look, all cases here have a general kernel of truth in them, at least, if not more so.
Yeah, and I think the way I was thinking of it is it's hard. It's just because it's hard to imagine doesn't mean it's going to happen, but hard to believe that between now and election time, there isn't something more formal on conditions that come out from the Biden administration on Israel. Like, hard to imagine that it just rides the way that it is right now. I mean, it would be a wonderful space if the two sides could come together and stop, but I have fairly low confidence in that. I could be wrong, of course, like I usually am on this stuff, but hard to think that there isn't some sort of declaration or demands put prior to election time. But I'm also not as close to like what the sentiment in polls are, to your point.
It's possible, right? I mean, you're already seeing the polls start to swing in Biden's direction. Granted, polls are worth their weight in nothing at this point.
Yeah.
But if Biden starts doing well, he may feel less pressure. It's possible. I don't know. But we're also at a different phase of the war now, right? I mean, at this point, the discussion is over how to do Rafah. It's not really about the widespread bombing campaign or a continue. I mean, yes, I know they just re-raided Al-Shifa, but can't imagine that's going to be, a common occurrence. We're now in this space where Israel's basically going to, if they heed America's advice, or basically do CT operations. And that And if that happens, where they're killing Hamas and the humanitarian situation is being improved, I don't think you're going to change a lot of people's minds, because I think a lot of people's views on this conflict are now either pre-debate or solid. But maybe enough where either it recedes to the headlines, or there's a good news story about Hamas is dead, Palestinians are alive, right? Or you know what I mean. Anyway. Tough argument to make, right? Tough argument to make, but it might be one that they maybe tries too strong, but like hint at. But I think if Biden can get to November and have Israelis feel like, and look, we should know that the polls in Israel like Biden a lot. Like, he's pretty popular there right now, in part because of his immediate reactions after October 7th. So if he can sort of show, like, I've got Israel's back, they have mine, Palestinians are on the mend, maybe that issue can at least recede and it can help it. But I don't know. It's a brutal political issue for them, which is of course secondary to the actual human condition of what's going on over there.
Yeah, I think, and similar to the Afghanistan issue, the longer it goes on without escalation, or it kind of hangs out as a status quo, the more politically amenable it gets, which again different than the outcomes for the humans that are involved. Just kind of transitioning into a different spot, and I know we're coming to the bottom of the hour, and I think we can go. I think we have it for another 40 minutes or so, but we can also go short wherever it goes. One of the reasons I really enjoy and used to find great utility out of reading the types of books that you wrote and the types of columns that you do is it has an effect of taking the both the political and the caricature of a president out and putting the staff back into the equation as a normalizing effect. And I think that was really clear during the Trump administration, oftentimes to his dismay, that the actual deep state is actually a thing by design. Otherwise, you end up having a human being who can do whatever they want. And as much as we like to think about a singular executive, the White House is a gigantic machine that has many moving parts, and is I can say this because I've had enough ex-colleagues and friends work in the White House. I've had, I think, for 3 or 4 administrations now, to know that the people that are involved are really quite impressive. They're some of the smartest people. They're certainly the smartest in their field. They are in politics and policy and government, and they're in the Oval Office. They've won the Super Bowl. They're the NFL head coach of what it is that they do. And while you may not agree with their politics of it, the room is full of smart, capable people thinking deeply and investing their time deeply in the problems. And I think reading your book pulls that out, because you have to talk to the people who has it. There's no story without the spaces that exist between the humans that have to engage with each other on a staff. That's where the actual story comes, from the transfer of information, from their takes on things, from the misjudgments they have, or the good ideas that they have, or the arguments and conflict, friction. That's what I found to be deeply useful. And when I would work in a region in my past life, and I would have to understand more about the foreign policy of why we were there and why I was there, I found books that focused on the staff work very useful. One, because oftentimes I was a staff officer myself and I recognized it. But 2, it helped kind of take away that caricature of the president into the staff. I don't know if you have a similar experience in engaging with them, or are you too close to it to kind of see that this is more of a craft skills discussion for you?
Well, 2 things. One, I didn't appreciate when the first draft of this book comes in, and my editor and publisher go, "This is a really good long article." Now, what makes it a story? And that took me some time to figure out. And it was my first book, so first of all, I appreciate you cared about the staff work as much as I did. Part of it was born from like, yes, I cover these people every day because I'm very aware that the presidency is the office of the president is a lot of people with their own biases and backgrounds and histories and beliefs. But also like they are part of the story of the United States. They are part of the story of our American foreign policy. And they are part of a tradition of people just like them, smart, dedicated, who most of them smart, dedicated, who are just trying to do the right thing. They don't always succeed. Oftentimes they don't. But it doesn't always come from a bad place. And so, there's a tragedy, but there's an optimism there. And they are the story of America to a certain extent. And so how are they as people in their time and place affecting all of us? I think that started to become very interesting to me. So Jake's background in Minnesota, how does that help him come up with foreign policy for the middle class? Antony Blinken's time studying in Paris, how does that make him a diplomat? Lloyd Austin's time going to mass with Beau Biden, how does that make him, maybe loyal to the president, arguably too loyal to the president? How does Bill Burr's time, Bill Burns' time as a diplomat inform the way he thinks about intelligence and human rights? Like, all of that matters. And all of that, at the end of the day, when you peel back the policy papers and the cables and all the things that make great stories or news articles, that's not the full story. The full story is the people writing them, the people advising, and what they bring literally to the room. So I got a lot of interest in that. And then when I started working on the second draft, it was, who are these people? So you can understand that when they make a decision, when they argue something, 100 pages later, you go, that sort of connects to, XYZ thing from their past. The other bit, and I want to give a bit of a shout out to Seth Wickersham, who wrote a book about the New England Patriots called It's Better to Be Feared. I went into that book thinking it's all about Brady and Belichick, and that's what the book really is. But then you realize, oh man, the offensive line coach really did a lot of work. The wide receivers coach did a lot of work. The scouts did a lot of work. The agents are involved in some ways. The healthcare professionals. And then you realize, okay, so it's not, yes, you can focus on the main characters and they do matter. They are who history will remember. But they are still a product of everyone underneath them and everyone working towards a common goal. So I think you can't tell the story of an administration, and you can't tell the story of American foreign policy, and you can't tell the story of American history without the staff. And I will say that I'm currently now trying and failing to read about a book about every president in order, and I've been coming to appreciate this more and more, that in every biography, well, of course, it's like 85% about, that president. A lot of it is like, George Washington doesn't get to where he is unless he marries Mary Custis, and, or Washington doesn't get to fight as well if he didn't have Alexander Hamilton writing his correspondence, right? Like, it all sort of fits in one way. So anyway, I've become deeply passionate about this point. So sorry. Thank you for letting me.
I'm with you. I don't know that I ever thought about reading a book about every president and their staff, though it's possible I'm reasonably close. I'm getting there. I think like through that, like we learn lessons like Washington's management of his staff was actually one of his towering strengths, which sounds weird because he's such a caricature of a person, and he's sitting in meetings having, leading with inquiry and managing people the way like you think about people today. I understand there's always some narrative spinning there. Lincoln's the book, my favorite one on Lincoln is the Team of Rivals, is really interesting to see how he goes across managing and just how many towering personalities he had on his staff for somebody with almost no political experience and background, like limited, not a ton. I don't know if you've read that one. For the
I watched the movie, but I haven't read the book yet. I read a different Lincoln book about his foreign policy because that's the nerd I am. Which I highly recommend. It's very good by Ken Ferrania. But no one really focuses on Lincoln's foreign policy. It was very restrained. It was very interesting. It affected how he thought about the Civil War. So anyway, plug for that book as well. There's no question. Like, look, honestly, in the same, and you alluded to this, like the history of Trump's foreign policy. Yes, it is Trump and who he is, but it is also the people around him, right? Like, and the stuff they tried to do. Like, we would be out of a free trade agreement with South Korea right now if Gary Cohn was not the National Economic Council director, because he literally took the piece of paper off of the Resolute desk, right? We wouldn't have had 3,000 more troops in Afghanistan if H.R. McMaster wasn't the national security advisor.
Right.
Because he pushed Trump for 9 months to get him to do something, and that was also on Trump. And McMaster wanted way more, but it was on Trump to be like, I'll do it, but not a lot. But look, we can't deny that presidents matter. They're the ultimate decision makers. I think of a moment where Iran shot down an American unmanned drone, and Mike Pompeo and John Bolton advised Trump to basically shoot Iranian targets that, by conservative estimates, would have killed 100 to 150 people. And it was Trump who said, that doesn't feel proportionate to me, right? And so we didn't shoot. The United States didn't shoot because Trump was the restrained one. Bolton, in his book, ends up calling that the worst decision he'd ever seen a president make. He was in the Bush administration, so take that for what it's worth. But anyway, so yeah, you sort of have to balance this, right? One as a reporter and two as an author is like, how much is the presidents do matter? They are the ultimate decision makers. Literally, the buck stops with them. That phrase should live forever. It is true. We give them the credit and crap on them if things go wrong, even if it's not their fault. We give them credit even if it's not because of them. So it does matter what they think and how they act, but it's really a lot of the work happens underneath them. And the most undercovered person in American national security reporting is the deputy national security advisor, who's like literally leading the interagency. And most decisions are done there. So that's something I need to start focusing on too. But no one cares about them, unfortunately, even though they are the most important. But like you could almost trace any foreign policy decision back to the work that person does.
And the chiefs of staff rule the world. Is another interesting dynamic that I witnessed first half working on flag staffs, and chiefs of staffs they basically, it's like they introduced our version of legislation. If you can't get the chief of staff on board, it's hard to get anything going. What surprised you the most about? I know we've covered a lot of stuff, but what surprised you the most in your research and in your process about the topic you're going to cover?
First of all, just how hard book writing is. I don't wish it on my worst enemy. It's what I do for a living. I read every day, and this is by far the hardest project I've ever had to do. But I might still do another one someday, but I definitely need a break. But that was surprising. I kind of went in. I mean, I had people telling me writing a book is like passing a kidney stone, and now I really fear passing a kidney stone because it seems bad. I think I was also surprised by. Sorry for how trite this is, but like how human a lot of these people were. Because I got to. I'm going to give a very crude example. When I was a younger person in DC, and a staffer at a think tank, John Kerry was Secretary of State, and he walks by to give a speech, and my boss caught me kind of just like with my eyes following him across the room, like, oh my God, here's this guy I studied and whatever. And my boss looked at me and he goes, he has diarrhea sometimes too. And I don't know why. I don't know what flipped in my head. But I was like, oh yeah, they're just dudes. Like they're just people. They're everyone you read about in a book and you sort of lionize them. Like they're just people. And in this process, even I cover them every day and I try to keep be removed from them because I have to cover them as dispassionately as I can. But when you write a book, you get to meet a lot of interesting people. And they'll spend a lot more time with you than if you were just doing an article. And you get to learn about them more as people and not just automatons working in government. And you come to realize just what a deeply human exercise this is. And I know this may sound trite, but it really hit me. And that's why I really tried to, to our conversation about staff work, like try to tease out not just who they are as professionals, but who they are as people, because I think that is also part of the story. I know that old adage, personnel is policy. Well, it's true. But who the personnel is also matters because that affects policy too. So it's like the sort of shadow era beforehand. So anyway, all this to say that I've talked to a lot of the people for my day job for this book, but that's a usually very removed professional interaction, and so it was for this book too. Don't get me wrong, but because you tend to spend more time with people and get to know kind of everything about them, you realize that there's just a lot more humanity in our government. And I don't mean that necessarily for good and bad. There's a lot more like personality, humanity, into what we do. So it's I've come and I hope it's impacting me as a day-to-day reporter. That like I also recognize like this shit is hard. Like this stuff is really, really hard. We know we can all Monday armchair quarterback any decision. And look, sometimes the correct decision is so obvious. We're like, how the heck did they do that? But as you alluded to earlier, like sometimes you're in the land of bad options, and you've got really people trying to do the right thing, having to make pretty horrible decisions, and that is both sort of a oddly comforting and also frightening at the same time. I try to report, and in this book and in my life, not from the perspective of you guys did it wrong. Obviously, it's well, if you did it wrong, you should get criticized for it. If you did it right, you should get praised for it. But let's also acknowledge that like foreign policy is not easy. Otherwise, we'd be crushing it, and we're not crushing it, right? And this is just a deeply hard world to operate in. And so, like, regardless of how one's doing, they will always, at least for me, have a kernel of respect because you put yourself in the arena at something pretty thankless and something that you're almost bound to fail.
And for usually a substantial, at least from the immediate sense, pay cut versus the alternatives you could be doing.
Yeah, but in the long term, you get paid. So that part doesn't matter.
I mean, in the near term, you're really just saving up for later. They do end up just fine. Trey says, interesting question, how Bill Burr would do as a diplomat. We'll likely never know. But
I'm a Boston boy, so I feel like I can answer this a little bit. He would be terrible. He would be terrible. But could you imagine just like a guy being crossed, like, give him the notes. Just see what happens. I think it'd be pretty good. I'd love to see it. Give me like 2 weeks of Bill Burr, Secretary of State. Just see what happens.
I think what's funny, the analogy there too, is I grew up in Atlantic City, where then Donald Trump employed the majority of the people I grew up around, for the people at least in the private sector. And when he ran for president, it became very real. Like I had to sift through quite a bit of simply like, what would Bill Burr be like as a diplomat? What would Donald Trump be like as a president? It's not quite to that extent, but at least in my experience, in my mind, I struggled deeply with it, which kind of goes back to the staff thing. Then you insert him into the apparatus of the White House, and it works mostly as it has. I know I had a few friends that were on the outgoing Obama administration, and their main gripe was that there was just less people on Trump's turnover team than they were used to. But other than that, it was transition in, transition out, and a lot of business as usual. And maybe it's the pessimist in me. I find some deep comfort in understanding that the machine kind of runs. You can change things. It's not easy, but that's kind of by design. I think the big question for me, like I don't think there's a reasonable answer. We would go back to an administration if there was a 4-year gap in a Trump 2-term administration. I think you alluded to it a little bit in the beginning. What do you think the biggest difference with that in that would be in the prediction world, of course? So
look, perils of prediction. I think we have one policy which seems like it's probably 2 policies that will probably happen, but also I think the macro thing is, if so we were talking about earlier, if it was like President Romney and it was Mattis and Tillerson and Mnuchin and all of those guys around, you'd be like, all right, fine, right? It would be a pretty standard, a little different, but mostly standard Republican administration. Everything would have been kind of fine. Even like a Rubio or Ted Cruz, like it would have just kind of operated at, normally. The fact that it was Trump is what gave it its edge, but mostly speaking, in some places, it was a more traditional Republican administration than I think people give it credit for, although, of course, there were some clear aberrations that we don't need to go into because we all know them. Second term, it's unclear who's left. It is unclear who's going to serve. I mean, we've got some ideas about who could be National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, but it's just going to be a different, more MAGA-aligned crew that, if you felt like Trump was kind of untethered in the first one, or unchained, he's definitely unchained now. If anything, he's encouraged to play.
Right.
Which brings us to the two policies that are probably going to happen. The first is, it's looking exceedingly likely that a Trump administration would bomb fentanyl labs in Mexico. That is something that he's talked about a lot. It's something that a lot of Republicans in Congress want to see. And for understandable reasons. Fentanyl is killing just extraordinary numbers of people in the United States. They're equating it to war. I mean, I think it's like yearly numbers are more than Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Like, something needs to be done. Maybe it's not bombing fentanyl labs, but maybe it is. I don't know. I'm not that smart on this issue, but that will cause all kinds of issues. And you don't have to be a military expert or a Mexico expert to understand that if that starts happening, you're going to have a lot of people coming to the southern border, with much realer asylum claims than before, fleeing violence, which will exacerbate another problem that Trump doesn't want. But that, I think, will be something that could happen. The other one is something to do with NATO. I don't think he can withdraw officially because of that Senate bill, but he doesn't have to, right? Like, all it just takes is that the U.S. doesn't participate in certain exercises, or a NATO country is invaded, and Trump, instead of saying, okay, defend them, just go show me their defense budget, right? Or whatever. And he doesn't have to invoke Article 5. He doesn't have to participate, in which case NATO as it exists is pretty much done. So it doesn't, everyone's focused on withdrawal. And it's true. We nearly withdrew. If you read John Bolton's book, there's a moment where Trump literally looks, he's in the room. He looks at Bolton and goes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to leave. And Bolton's like, walk up to the line and don't do it. And so Trump doesn't. But that's how close we came. And there isn't going to be a John Bolton next time. So, I think some sort of minimization of America's role in NATO seems almost guaranteed.
I think what you just said there was really interesting from a where are we on the arc of time discussion. Like, there isn't going to be a John Bolton. And for two reasons. One, it's the second Trump administration. And so, to your point, who's left? The other one is that's from a different age, a different era. We're now pushing, approaching 10 years since Obama. Almost 16, 17 years since Bush. And the world that exists right now is a world where Trump is not new. It is almost institutionalized. And then from there, and that's by design too, right? That's how politics works. When there are pivots, there's kind of political systems at work where this is the things that are salient, these are the things that are on the table, these are the things that are not. We now have the menu that was brought to us by 2016 to choose from. And I don't know how long it lasts for that. We do seem to be able to not figure out how to get new actual executive candidates in. We're still retreading the past. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think the other I have two. One is a semi-serious question. What do you get from being for a Pulitzer finalist? What is the artifact you actually get from the group of finalists?
You don't get anything. You just get a bunch of people asking why you didn't win. No, there's just no win. It's there's no silver medal, or you actually don't know where you ended up in the voting. You know who wins, and then the other two are just kind of like, oh, all right. So yeah, you just kind of hang out.
You do get to put it on the bottom of the book, though.
Do you get to put it on the bottom of the book? I guess that's the artifact.
And that's pretty cool. Like, I'm not a Pulitzer finalist, so I think it's amazing. I think that is probably another space, because that's not exactly related to the topic you're on. And just so everybody knows, it was reporting on the leak for Roe v. Wade. Correct? That's
yeah.
What are you working on next?
Well, it's still my day. My day job is still to be the White House reporter for national security. So I gotta keep talking to the administration, see what they're up to, what they're planning. They've still got a lot more work to do in Ukraine. Still a lot more work to do on China. If they're headed out, they're gonna go out with a bang. Here, it sounds like they've got a lot of stuff in the works. But it'll be interesting to see the Trump Biden foreign policy debate. That I'm always interested in. This will be my third election that I'm covering, like as a writer and analyst and reporter, and I guess my second Trump Biden,
Right.
and my third Trump. Yeah, Trump's been in each one of them. So I feel like I know the guy well. I've read all of his books, and all of his Playboy interviews for the interviews, and
I have an article in Playboy, by the way. They do exactly.
It's a great publication if you read it for the articles.
Proof positive.
Yeah, 100%. So, I this is the moment I find interesting because I get why when they're presidential debates, they focus on domestic issues. That's what people care about. But as a reporter and also as a citizen, these debates kind of don't matter. Not only because of the performative nature of them and the fact that they're basically infomercials, but because almost everything that they talk about needs Congress. And none of them talk about how they actually have the votes for Congress. It's why, during the Republican debates, I was actually kind of refreshed, and I know that there were political reasons for it. But I appreciate when Nikki Haley was like, look, we can talk national abortion ban all we want, but there aren't votes in the Senate, so why are we having this conversation? And I know why, again, there are political reasons for her to say that, but it also had the benefit of being true, right? So I also appreciate these debates, or these moments, because they're just, the president is the foreign policy to a certain extent, right? And the staff. There are very few, if any, real restrictions on how they operate. And so you have to kind of care about presidential politics and presidential debate, because what they're saying very easily could be policy. It doesn't take much. So these are great moments to really get a sense of, up till now, the man, how they're thinking about a changing world, how they're dealing with the politics of foreign policy. There's just a lot of fodder, and I just find this is that debate is always actually kind of great. Everything else is pretty pie in the sky stuff.
Yeah, and I think it also has the most amount of variables. Sorry, the biggest variance. You can, to your point, there's less friction to move from one side to the other on foreign policy than there is on domestic issues. What's the velocity like between the two? Meaning, is it the pace of things different between, say, a Trump or a Biden, or is it really all just the same but different flavor of things?
Look, the pace of Trump was insane. In part because he was, for the media, he was our assignment editor, right? You woke up every morning, you looked at your phone, and there was 80 tweets, 2 of which were genuine foreign policy pronouncements. Right. You're like, oh, okay, I guess that's the story now. And it was just every day, right? I can remember waking up and being my button's bigger than your button, Kim. Or if Putin thinks he's going to get away with this, it's those are legitimate statements from a president and foreign policy pronouncements that we have to cover journalistically. You can't ignore them. Biden goes through the normal process, and I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of things going on, but he isn't tweeting out new policy positions, and he isn't doing that multiple times a day. So, look, I still have my hands full with 2 wars to cover, a competition with China, the foreign policyization of everything.
Yeah.
But it is certainly not as much as it was under Trump. And so, if Trump were to come back, I expect to have to I do have Truth Social and I do keep a tab on what Trump is saying, but I feel like I don't have to as much. If he's president again, every day I'm gonna have to start scrolling his feed once again for another 4 years.
Wedged in between commentary on actors and Hollywood celebrities is foreign policy doctrine on the Twitter. That was the wildest thing that I've seen in my lifetime. And I had just gotten out of I'd left active duty service the year before he was elected, and I'm not exactly sure what it was like serving under that space.
Well, yeah,
I mean that in a literal sense. I don't know. Would have been interesting.
What will shock and not shock you is having now talked to a lot of former, Trump administration folks who were in the White House and involved in his foreign policy, national security making. I would go, how often, were the tweets a result of like the end of a policy review, or that he tweeted and then you all had to retrofit? And again, it will shock and not shock you to hear that it was almost exclusively retrofitting, right? He would say something, and then the apparatus would have to scramble and fit it. Now, I don't want to overplay this. There were certain times where he was announcing something that had been thought through,
right,
or there was stuff behind it, but very often it was just like, all right, they're done.
You could tell in the syntax. You could often tell in the syntax of the tweet what one of those things it was.
The transgender military ban, right? Mattis was on vacation, if I recall. Like that was, it was just something that Trump decided to do. You can agree or disagree with the policy, but like that didn't go through a review process or a formal review process. Even now, Trump is sort of having that effect. I mean, outside of the Ukraine supplemental vote, I mean, Trump one day kind of out of nowhere goes, okay, foreign aid and military assistance are now loans. And they're always going to be loans, and they can be indefinite and no interest, but we're going to get paid back someday. And what's the hotness now among Republicans? We only do this via loans. It took no time. So part of it is just he is either skilled at or has an easy lane. I don't know what it is, but like whatever ideas he's coming up with end up either American policy or dominate at least one party's debate on key issues. So like that is the most important social media accounts in the world, because the world is literally changing based upon those misses.
Yeah, and kind of to that point, Trey asks, what are the ramifications to the Republican Party of a decade of Trump in charge? I think it's going to be longer than a decade. Even if after he's gone, it's a bit like Voldemort, where it just continues on. The trajectory shift is, at least for the normal distance of a normal political cycle, 30, 40 years, it just kind of hangs out and dictates some shift. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I think it's there already. Like, I don't think we're trying to come to grips with what's going to happen. I think it's already happened, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, when during the election with Clinton, I was out there incorrectly assessing that Trump was going to be the most influential loser since Barry Goldwater. Turns out he's the most influential winner.
Yeah, half right.
Yeah. But since Reagan, I mean, like, I'm literally racking my brain to think of, presuming Trump wins and he is out, or regardless, right? 4 years from now, when God willing, it's two different men, or whatever. I am struggled to think that the Republican will be like a Reagan traditional foreign policy Republican. It's just not what the party wants right now. Trumpism will exist far beyond Trump, and the Josh Hawleys and the J.D. Vances of the world, their views, I think, are becoming the more mainstream foreign policy view. Rand Paul isn't as alone as he was anymore. Right. And so, like, who is going to pick up the Nikki Haley standard? Who's going to pick up the Mitt Romney torch 4 years from now? It could happen. I don't know. I don't know. But I struggle to think. It feels like it's going to be like a Vance versus some Republican governor I've never heard of, like, something like that. And it feels like the Democrats are going to be making a lot of quote unquote Reagan-esque points. I mean, it's flipped, right? I mean, now the Democrats are the anti-Russia party. The Republicans are not. They're not pro-Russia, but they are more Russia-friendly, or at least not willing to be as anti-Russia is probably the more accurate description. So, like, we're through a realignment now. How long it lasts, I don't know, but I agree with you. I think it's going to be more than a decade, and it will take a lot. And it's usually, what I mean by that is usually not something good, in order to go back to the mean, if we want to call it the mean. But look, we've had this strain in our history before. It tends to come in cycles. And look, after Reagan overseeing the collapse of the Soviet Union, and George W. Bush too, I can get why Republicans were, thought that was the way forward. But I think we also cannot discount, by the way, in the story, the failure of the neoconservative movement, which had taken which was a big part of the Republican foreign policy making. And this is also a backlash. The backlash started with the Democrats and has moved into Republicans. And so they're also dealing with that too. And so do you get those sort of voices back? I don't know. And if you do, it takes a long time.
I think it's hard to argue anything other than if you look at the movement of the entire apparatus is into it's a more conservative view, whereas you make the argument that Obama as a Democratic president was a Eisenhower Republican. From a policy perspective,
yeah.
It's not a one for one, but like if you wanted to pick one, it's not that hard to look at those two and see the difference. And if you go back throughout our history, we have these watershed events. We have, obviously the very beginning, and then the Jacksonian democracy is a shift, and then all that comes in the run up to the Civil War, and then and Lincoln, and then you have the progressives and Roosevelt, and then you have the shift into the New Deal. And what was also interesting throughout history is how often conservative and liberal were actually not delineated by party. That parties themselves were not always broken down by conservative or liberal. It was more often sometimes regional or specific policy. And then you go into the Reagan era and beyond, and now it's the Trump era, right? It's kind of where we are, and not saying that it's about Trump and Trump is the victor or wherever. It's just that was the shift. That was the thing that drove a pivot from the old into the new. And, my perspective is I just want the machine to work. One of the great benefits of starting my adult life in military service is that to be able to remain somewhat apolitical and just want the thing to work. I would like democracy. I would like the United States. I would like health and prosperity for people as long as we can get it. And it's not that unhealthy to have pivots. And so to hope for the best through it is kind of my enduring space. And talking to people like yourself and reading books like you wrote. I mean it when I say it. I did enjoy it a lot. It brought me back to the times when I was reading about the foreign policy, the regions I was working in, and reading Bob Woodward, while I was sitting in Iraq and wondering how those books and people who technically I reported up in the chain of command. It was great to hear it firsthand. It's critical work that you do. So thank you for that, and thank you for the time here.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast. Hope that was all right.
All right, I think we're here to hand it over to the next live stream.
Okay.
I'm assuming we're just good to go then.
Okay, sounds good. I'll head out.
All right, are you guys ready for me to end it?
Yes.
All right.
Well, any parting words?
Thank you. This was great.
Thanks, Alex. It was awesome talk. Thank you.
Yeah, very good discussion. I listened to you guys the whole time.
Take it.
You too.
Yep.
Bye, guys.
welcome everybody to this Interact Super Salon that I'm extremely excited about, because our special guest tonight is a very good friend of mine, Eric Howell. I kept feeling as I was reading your new book that you need some kind of extra added letter in your name. It's too casual. Eric Howell, for this kind of work, you need to be like Eric P. Howell or something. Have you ever thought about adding a non-physical extra letter?
In fact, yes. My middle name is Parker. So that would work perfectly. But yet, as a high school friend of mine pointed out very early on, my name is often mispronounced Holt. So Eric P. Holt is probably not the best sign off for an author. So I've avoided the middle initial. Type of books. Ever since he so lovingly pointed that out. I thought that was just a really nice thing for him to immediately think of and jump to. And I was so traumatized that I've avoided it ever since. But thank you, because some of my favorite authors have like the the very non-casual name.
Absolutely. But you have time. You're still very disturbingly young for writing such books. So after the Revelations, which I like to call, as you know, and maybe you don't like this, a road movie inside a mind, that was also somehow mysteriously and deeply influenced and inspired by Kierkegaard. You came out with this nonfiction book that, if I'm not mistaken, you simultaneously wrote, or at least with a big overlap with your fiction book, The World Within the World. It wasn't Simon & Schuster.
It wasn't exactly overlapping, and I think that's just because it is just fundamentally true that nonfiction is easier than fiction. If anyone tells you the opposite, they're just not a good fiction writer. Like, fiction is really hard. Fiction books like attack you back in ways that nonfiction books don't. Right. So you're sort of in some sort of like deeper Promethean struggle when you're doing fiction, and like nonfiction. I think that can exist when you're like really trying to say, like, come up with like a new scientific theory or something. Right. But like in general, I think nonfiction is just a little bit easier because it's often it's so much more concrete, and you aren't like fighting an adversary as you go along. So like the fiction book took me, essentially 10 years, and this nonfiction book took me, essentially like a year or 2 years of writing. And I think that just sort of holds generally. I don't really trust anyone who says the opposite, because I think every fiction writer knows what it is to have your book sort of fight you back. And then for you to feel like totally lost, and like, how are you going to actually put everything together where the pacing makes sense and so on.
And that's very well aligned with the message of this book, right? Like, there's the extrinsic genre of the nonfiction, and as you describe the novel toward the middle of the book, as being the ultimate intrinsic technology, where you even solve the problem of the other minds. I want to talk to you a little bit about this, what you call the epistemological hybrid zone. You talk about your upbringing, which you, like, it was some kind of 1940s family movie you spent in your mother's independent bookstore, and you devoured not just fiction books, but also, after a while, scientific books. But you do exist between these two worlds. And everything in your book is about dualism. You own up to it in the opening sentence of the book. Do you maybe want to talk a little bit about this epistemological liminal zone that you seem to have been inhabiting since day one of Eric Howell, and how did that lead you to writing this book, which I hear was very easy? Guys, write a great nonfiction book tomorrow.
It's such a good question. And let me problematize it though, like slightly, in that, I think ultimately what you'll find is that, if you go to like sell a company or do anything else, you'll find an incredibly pat correlation between, what exactly happened in the CEO's life and then the exact sort of company that they were that they're doing now, right? And no one's ever just like, I just started this business because I liked it or I thought it was interesting, right? Everyone sort of has to have like a personal story. And I think there's a deep sense in which like intellectuals are not immune to this sort of self mythology that can sort of creep in. I think there is a deep sense in which I was always interested in consciousness from the fact that I grew up in a bookstore and I love fiction, and I always thought I would be a fiction author. And I really didn't really think I would do anything else. And then I found science and I was good, and I found that I was sort of good at it. Like the professors seemed to like what I was saying, and I had like a good rapport with them, and it seemed like this could actually be something that I could go out and do. And I looked around within the scientific field, and I thought, what are my strengths? Well, I'm not like the best mathematician in the world. Like I have some papers that are almost like pure math, but I'll be the first to say that I'm not actually very good, mathematician. Like if I wanted to go and like make a contribution to string theory, I think that that's probably fundamentally beyond me.
Although I remember the first time I ever corresponded with you via post, I remember this particularly because what your address was, because your address at Princeton was 1 Einstein Drive. So are you maybe being a little bit too modest here? Maybe your concept of that not being good at math and mine are maybe very different here.
Yeah. This is spoken from a sort of a ridiculous vantage. But like but I thought within the field of consciousness research, it seemed like there were some really big open questions in science, and consciousness I thought was one of them. It seemed like very unknown, like very open, and so it seemed like a place where maybe I could sort of be a little bit more creative, and where being like interdisciplinary and having lots of interests would actually be something relevant, versus if you're just doing string theory, there's really nothing that's that relevant beyond string theory, right? Some other parts of physics, right? That's and some math, right? But within something like consciousness research, it seems like it could draw on all sorts of different domains. And so there's one story in which, I'm sort of like continuously interested in consciousness, from a very early age. And then there's sort of like another story, which is that, in a sense, becoming a scientist was like a practical matter, wherein I thought, well, this seems like a fun, interesting career, and I think I could do it. And so I maybe I could like support myself as I write books. Because of course I knew that would be a problem. Growing up in a bookstore, you meet a lot of authors who would come by for talks, and the number of authors who actually fully support or say fully support a family, like let alone even just themselves, right? But like imagine can really contribute to a household from just selling writing is very low. It's very low. You generally are a writing professor. So anyways, that's just to sort of put like a more like materialistic like spin on the more like traditional like self mythology, but this probably like all of it's true, to a certain extent. But anyways, I loved writing this book because it was stuff that I had been thinking about for 10 years. So when I say I sort of found it easy, right? It's specifically because I went out, I got my PhD working with essentially the top US lab that was doing scientific research into consciousness, and working on some of the leading theories. And so this epistemological hybrid zone that you brought up, when you're working on like the very cutting edge of science, so that's so like at the edge that you don't even know if what you're doing is at all correct, right? Like people say, oh, you worked at the cutting edge of science. It sounds so like romantic and like nice. Yeah. But like the problem with the cutting edge of science is that you can like waste your life, right? I mean, there's a very real possibility when you're sort of like out on the edge. Like, you don't know if what you're doing is going to actually end up being real, if it is actually going to end up being useful. So
it's kind of weird note to have somebody who basically chooses science as other people choose a day job. Like, oh, I'm going to do this simple little matter that I just somehow I'm just good at it, and then this will support me writing my books. and then even within that, you kind of gravitate towards the more cutting edge fringe stuff, right?
Yeah,
Because
a
you worked,
foolish decision, right?
I was very impressed by how you actually, I mean, you kind of cover that era in your life in your novel, The Revelations, but you also go back to the birth of the integrated information theory and your work with Tononi. And this is basically, you know, in startups, you know, it's not, startups are not just autobiographical, but they are basically driving a car whilst assembling it. And I feel that when you're working on the fringes of science in a successful and productive and constructive way and not wasting your life, you must have felt a little bit like that with every paper, I mean, you know, we discussed Friston, we discussed emergence, you wrote beautifully about, you know, when the map is better than the territory, et cetera, like basically, like with AI research in the past 10 years, it's the actual live papers that are creating the field.
Yeah, and I think there's also a sense in which this book is, and you know, it's fundamentally in a way a pessimistic book, and that's from having spent, you know, so much time deep in the weeds at this very edge of science. I say at some point in the book that, you know, when I entered science, I thought that the universe was knowable, and now at the end of an education, I think the universe is unknowable. And I've really become much more sort of a skeptic, not just of sort of not just of sort of like methodological aspects of science, right? Like any science you can take and you can critique, you know, some various, you know, overhyped aspect of it, or its methodology, or, you know, so on. And some of that's really interesting, and some of that's like really trivial, like it's stuff that ends up getting self-corrected and washed out, and it's just really not a problem. But when it comes to, you know, understanding consciousness, this is something that has been being attempted for a very long time, and we sort of don't currently have a very good scientific theory. And we have some inklings of what maybe sort of semi-satisfactory scientific theories might look like, but they're never fully satisfactory. And I think that probably indicates something really significant. Like I don't think that that's just it. I don't think it's just like sort of this weird coincidence that this one part of science lags so much the other aspects of science as they race ahead, right? It would be sort of a very strange scenario wherein it's just this like statistical process where some fields make a lot of progress and some fields, you know, don't. And I don't know if it has too much to do with, you know, the complexity. Like we have science of very, very complex things. And, you know, you could make an argument that it is just due to the complexity. I think that that's probably the best argument that you can sort of make, is just to say, listen, we're dealing with this, you know, massive parameter system, which is the human brain. It's extremely complex, right? But you sort of have to do a lot of work with that argument. So in a way, you know, this is like a rare sort of pessimistic, you know, popular science book. In that, you know, a lot of you know, scientific books are sort of you know, rah, look how far we've come. And this one is a bit more sort of like reflective. I don't know if that's like a good thing, or if that's like a deeply attractive thesis in the current world, but it's an honest reflection. And I kind of hope that I made it like an interesting pessimism, right? It's like you can offer forward some form of pessimism, right? But then you have to make it interesting. So to me, that was actually the biggest challenge of the book, is getting
Did you feel a responsibility to be upbeat? Did you feel that there's a, like, you know, every nonfiction book these days has to be aspirational? Did you feel in some ways that was not the case?
Yeah, and you can't, I mean, you know, if you go on Amazon, right, and you look at like the even like the description, you know, that the publisher wrote of the book, it's like some, you know, you know, it's like discover the mystery of consciousness and discover like the, right, it's I forget exactly what it is, but it's just sort of the copy that they write, you know, for all popular science books, right? And I can't, I can't control that. They have all the power in the relationship, right? These big publishers. So yeah, like it's almost like it's almost like impossible to even communicate to even the people who publish nonfiction books, that, hey, you could actually say something interesting that's not like, here's my individual pet theory that I'm going to go, promote the heck out of, or like, hey guys, did you know about brain imaging? We got it all figured out, right? Like just like getting anything else through is very difficult, and sort of relies on you being like, yes, my book definitely fits that frame, and then just writing, whatever you're gonna write. and then it's
really
it's too late.
you're saying that, because for me it did not, I felt very empowered reading it, and I think you treat the ancient sources, even instances where the translations might be very very, very different one from the other, with a lot of respect, and you kind of like go against opinions that say that our ancestors were these dumb automatons, and at some point the bicameral mind just started overlapping, the Venn diagram happened, and now we're very smart. And you are also you seem very open-minded about the question of free will. You kind of go there via your notes on emergence. So we know a lot of, and you actually talk about fatalism, right? And that my critique about certain popular science writers these days tends to be about my issues with people being overly deterministic or fatalist, or have a fatalist or defeatist notion about the world. I really would like to stop for a second before we really dive into what might be wrong with neuroscience and what we can do about it, just to give the room a chance to ask any questions about this very interesting background that Eric arrives to non-fiction writing too. And if you want to share any stories from your life where you felt that your artistic instincts and your scientific ambitions or abilities clashed or even supported each other. This is your moment. Anybody here working on an artistic project these days?
I love hearing about science and as it combines with art. This is one of the things that my wife used to do. She was a gallery artist in New York City, and she ran an organization called SciArt, and she makes sculpture about science. And so I sort of love artistic takes on science. So yeah, it's just to support anyone who actually has one.
That's an amazing job. Talk about creating your own job, right?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting with science and art is just that like when you put them together, I think what's interesting is that you always have to like have the art be dominant. So it's like it's a very like common mistake to sort of like mix the two, and then you let the science be dominant, because science is like very fundamentally dominant as an epistemic force, right? Like science is this huge person wearing a t-shirt that says capital T truth, who sort of bullies everyone around them, and that's like good, right? In a lot of circumstances that's like really good. But if you put like too much science in a novel, or you put too much science in an art piece, it can really it can really sort of overwhelm it in the wrong way. So it requires a bit of a subtle touch.
Do you have a favorite? I think we probably discussed Asimov at some point, but do you have role models when it comes to scientists who are also artists, other than your wife? Especially I'm thinking about writers and novelists who come from a scientific angle.
Thank you for mentioning her and saving me. I was racking my brain for authors. I think that I have people who I really like who are academics and also artists. Not so many scientists. I think it's really, really rare. I mean, it's very hard to name even one. Like maybe like C.P. Snow. You could go back to. I don't know if I would say that I'm like a huge C.P. Snow fan. I think I read some of his fiction. I thought it was like good. An example I think of someone who was amazing as both an academic and an artist would be like Umberto Eco. And there's a few other essentially Italian names, who sort of occupy and exist within that duality, but it's very rare. It's very difficult to understand. And in fact, I still get reviews coming in for the Italian edition of the Revelations, where like my Italian, the publisher there,
they get you, they get what
they're always like, hey, you're being reviewed in like the Pope's periodical, right? And it's some like stupid, they're like, this magazine is 5,000 years old, and you're being featured in it, right? And it's and they sent me this like periodically, right? And then in like the US, right, like nobody reviewed it when it came out. And I think a big part of that is just that no one knows what to do with that. It's a very strange archetype. It basically is not an American archetype. The artist scientist. It's just not an American. It's a European archetype, but it's not really an American archetype. Americans really love specialization, and that's not always a bad thing. I don't say that as like this massive complaint, but sort of the interdisciplinary like artist scientist is very much a European figure. So it's very difficult to sort of even communicate like what the project is to outlets and publishers here in the US.
Yeah, I can only think of poets like Dana Gioia, who's a scientist and a poet, and Zoe Hitzig, but she's also, I think she's an economist. I don't know if you count that as a science coming from.
Sure.
I know there is a debate there. Alan Lightman, yeah. Oh my God, that's very true.
Alan Lightman is a great example.
What should we read by Alan Lightman, Castro?
I loved his book, Einstein's Dreams. I mean, that was the only one that I read. It was like different ideas about time travel or like, how time works.
Yeah, that's a beautiful book. Just an utterly gorgeous book. He has a recent one that's like Stars Over Maine, something like that. That's quite good. He used to actually come into the bookstore, and you're right. That's a great reference for an American who occupies that archetype. Although I don't know, I think he has a science background, but is he like, was he like a working? So I don't actually know, but I'd be very interested in finding out. But yeah, he's a great example. You're probably right. He's probably the closest to the archetype in the United States. So there's writers who deal with science. Yeah.
There's writers America can learn from Europe, finally. Not just high cuisine.
Well, I think it's really important because I think that it's really important just like for culture, I think, to have some sort of ability to go back and forth between the sides. I mean, I do think that when you say like it's very difficult to name figures in America who are both some sort of famous artist and either have a scientific background or are literally in sciences, or even just in academics in general, right? Are there that many, like I mentioned Umberto Eco, is there that many like philosophy professors who are writing really great literature in the United States? I think that's really rare. Maybe I would throw in Rebecca Goldstein as a possible example of somebody who sort of fits into that role. But Rebecca Goldstein is not a very not a very popular writer, right? Like I saw a few people like nodding their heads or so on, but like most people, it's not like she's some sort of wild bestseller, big, huge cultural figure, right? It's a very difficult archetype to occupy and get sort of traction with in the United States, I think.
But I would imagine that it's the scientific academic life that might be at risk when somebody openly indulges in artistic pursuits, not the other way around.
I really think it's just like this American pragmatic nature. I'm generalizing like massively here when I talk about America versus European differences, but I do think that there's very much a sense in which just look at, for example, the discipline of philosophy and how they differ between like analytic philosophy versus continental philosophy. Right now, I probably am much more of a fan of analytic philosophy than I am of continental philosophy, but I'm more than willing to also admit that in sort of being very strict about carving off everything sort of literary, everything sociological and abstract, I think analytic philosophy probably did lose something really significant there. And I think that that's sort of a perfect example of that. Like even within philosophy, right, which is sort of it's the study of how everything hangs together, right? In America, it's still like, okay, we're just going to do this, right? And so I think that, I don't know, again, generalizing hugely here, but I think that that is like a really fundamental difference, and it's really hard to overcome.
It's the utility tyranny. You must not waste your time. I think you must serve a good purpose. I mean, sometimes I try to. I'm so blessed in my life that Americans get interintellect, because interintellect makes no sense, right? Like you're not networking, you're not finding a dating partner, you're not getting you might, but it's not the primary goal of an interintellect salon or being in the community. It's kind of an end in itself. And to me, that's a very non-American thing. Even though I know that all Americans will agree that the best things in life make no sense. Like sometimes you read these terrible articles like how, you should have kids so that you're not depressed and your friends have like a mental health purpose in your life. And yeah, of course, those things are true, but at the same time, that's not why you do it. There are things that you just do because you want to be a human and you want to spend your time that is worthy of a human. So I really, really love that note. And that note, let's dive into neuroscience. According to your wonderful book, The World Behind the World, we as humans are assumed to have been interested in our inner lives, even in the days when we did not consider it to be an inner life, when we kind of projected our thoughts and feelings into imaginary creatures and imagined having conversations with them. Some of us still do, right? Especially on TikTok. How did we get from there to an extremely trendy academic field from which innumerable amounts of popular science books emerge every year, but which, according to your book, is a bit sus from the point of view of basically every pharmaceutical company of note in the world, and seems to lead to no actual medical breakthroughs. So do you want to maybe in a couple of tweets summarize this very complicated journey for us?
Yeah, I think if to again like wildly generalize, one of my favorite actual types of popular writing is sort of big history. I think it sort of gets a bad rap in that like someone has to do it, right? It's like ultimately you need to have like really big overarching handles and perspectives on history, on how things develop. And there is a little bit of a tradition, particularly with Julian Jaynes, of consciousness researchers sort of doing a little bit of big history. And Julian Jaynes, wrote this book, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. I think it came out in 1976. And it's been a cult classic ever since. It's very popular within the field of consciousness research. I think the conclusions are understandably greeted with immense skepticism if you're familiar at all with sort of his arguments. But the fun part is that he's sort of taking this perspective of let's look at history through the lens of our understanding of consciousness. And so that's one thing that I wanted to mimic in the book, but I wanted to sort of do it in a way that I thought was less crazy. Like I wanted to do it in a way that I thought that maybe the hypothesis is like viable, right?
By the way, sorry to interrupt, but I just a side question. What happened in 1976? Because it seems to be such a crucial year for popular science books. I mean, The Selfish Gene and a couple of other things that we throw around all came out in this one year. Was there some kind of, I'm thinking of like the history of television and the kind of like the Sagan, right? Like these televised science shows. Was that what was the decisive factor here?
Well,
There
Dawkins,
seems to have been a breakthrough in the kind of public's understanding of hard science or its interest in it in that year.
that's a whole Substack article right there. Dawkins, I mean, the Selfish Gene was a PhD thesis that Dawkins wrote originally. I believe it's his PhD thesis, which is wild if you are at all familiar with the PhD program nowadays. Certainly, that was not my. I would have loved that. I mean, there's a deep sense in which this would have been my my PhD thesis, right? But with that has wildly sort of fallen out of fashion. So I'm not sure, but maybe there is some sort of some sort of like peak overlap of right around 76.
Sorry for the side question. That sounds like an entire different salon. Sorry about that.
No,
We can't see you right now, Eric, though.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, well, sorry. It should come back at some point. As I said, my internet's been terrible all day, but I can still hear everybody. So let me know if I'm still gone in a couple minutes. Let me know.
So we are in 1976, and this book comes out and changes the public's understanding of neuroscience or the theory of mind.
It's just like a really classic example of trying to do big history. And so when I was thinking about these same issues, the big history story that I tell for like the first third of the book is really that humanity essentially spends time developing these two particular, I call them perspectives. You could think of them as frameworks, right? And the two main ones that it deals with is the extrinsic world, which everyone is familiar with in terms of physics, right? Thinking about things in terms of mechanisms, billiard balls, and that story is like very well told of how this perspective gets developed, a very good understanding of what I call the extrinsic perspective to sort of summarize together all mechanistic understanding. And the extrinsic perspective gets reified into science, right? So you could think of science as sort of the apotheosis of the extrinsic perspective. It's like fully sharpened final form. But a part of that interesting story is that, at the same time, humans are developing this intrinsic perspective, and that we're also clearly getting better and better about talking about our internal states and expressing.
Eric, come back. I'm going to tell you how we develop the intrinsic perspective.
Where was I? Can you hear me now?
How we increasingly...
I'm getting a notification as if I didn't know that my internet connection is unstable. Okay. Let's see if this just let's see if we can just chart the ship through the choppy waters here.
So we're talking about how we started developing an intrinsic perspective as well, and in the first 1/3 of your book, you're guiding us through the big history of that story, basically.
Yeah, and it's interesting because these perspectives are sort of developing in opposite directions, right? It's like you're getting really good really good at talking about minds, and you're getting really good about talking about things, but you're not applying the two perspectives to one another. In fact, a huge amount of the progress of civilization is essentially the separation and then separate development of the two perspectives. And so that's sort of my really big history claim, that these frameworks are like not natural, that they historically developed, and that one of the things that makes us like moderns, like and something that we do reflectively and without thinking about it, is that we have very good frameworks for the intrinsic perspective for talking about consciousness and other minds, and we have very good frameworks for talking about the extrinsic perspective, like things out in the world in physics, and we sort of switch between the two with great facility. And that's sort of that's sort of a marker of the development of our civilization. So I think I call them like cognitive tools, and that a huge amount of sort of the intellectual work of civilization, beyond just the content of what you're doing, is sort of just expanding these two perspectives and keeping them very orthogonal. Of course, the problem with keeping them orthogonal is that you eventually have to deal with the brain, and the brain is where the two meet, right? So you can sort of keep them orthogonal as much as possible and develop them separately, but eventually you're forced to try to put them back together and say, okay, how can we, the far more popular view is, let's take the intrinsic perspective and try to sort of just stuff it within the extrinsic perspective and figure out if we can just derive, the intrinsic perspective from the extrinsic. And that's the science of consciousness. So, in my mind, the science of consciousness is the meeting point of it's like the forcing back together of, don't cross the streams of these two streams that humanity has been, really working on and developing and honing. And then they're like forced back together because you just can't ignore the fact that minds are physical things, as in there is a brain. That's all I mean by that. You just can't really ignore that, despite the fact that people really tried. I mean, especially within the history of science, I think one of the reasons why science was so initially successful is effectively Galileo, who makes this very clear demarcation where he says, just don't talk about qualitative properties. They're not really scientific. Just talk about, things we can very clearly measure. So, momentum and so on, right? Just think about the world as if it's made of geometry and mechanism. And that strategy, I mean, there's no denying it's been immensely successful historically, right? I mean, it almost like the faith in it is really important for science, right? Like you just have to have faith that you can actually even figure stuff out and develop like a convincing extrinsic view of the world. But the problem is that if you're a neuroscientist, you're eventually forced to try to reconcile these two perspectives again. And I think that that's where all the trouble for neuroscience comes from. It comes from its unfortunate position as being like the meeting point for essentially two conceptions of the world that really don't have that much to do with one another. And they're sort of forced to fit in together. And so that makes it very special and very difficult as a science.
Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about this interesting distinction that you draw in your book between consciousness and theory of mind, which was a kind of, I mean, I'm obviously a layperson here, but it was a kind of news to me because I always thought that these might be used interchangeably, and they might be by some journalists who might not know that much about it. What are the real intrinsic differences between the two the two phrases?
I think some people, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong, use theory of mind as broadly as you possibly could, right? So you could say theory of mind, and then you could mean any sort of statements or thoughts about minds, right? But if you look at the literature and the people who say study theory of mind, so for example, there's neuroscientists and who study things like, for people who have severe autism, do they lack a certain theory of mind and so on. If you look at that sort of theory of mind, like the theory of mind that people measure and study, it's generally about understanding people's behavior through what their current beliefs are. And an example might be, they also give tests to, for example, where in development do you get theory of mind, right? And an example might be that you take, a researcher comes in, takes candy, puts it in a drawer, someone else comes in, removes the candy, and then the researcher comes back and you ask the kid, where does this person think the candy, where are they going to go? Are they going to go look in the drawer or somewhere else? And if they don't have theory of mind, they're like, well, they're not going to look in the drawer. They're going to look over there because they're not remembering that, of course, this person thinks that the candy's in the drawer, right? So it's like this behavioral aspect to inferring experiences. But if you just think about children, if any of you have known young children or have had young children, you know that they get better about talking about their own consciousness. They sort of get more and more access into their own internal states, and they get better understanding of other people's states. And sometimes that understanding has to directly do with the beliefs that they hold and how that motivates behavior. But sometimes it's just like the ability to express the state of your own mind, or to understand what the state of someone else's mind is once they express it, and to just like understand and articulate the depths of their own consciousness. In philosophy of mind, there's this very useful distinction between phenomenal consciousness. That's like sort of like everything you're currently experiencing right now in your stream of consciousness, and access consciousness, which is what you could currently express about what you're seeing and feeling and so on. And so there's this very classic philosophical question, which is, well, are the two perfectly overlapping, or not? And, in the original, article that sort of proposed this distinction, it's argued that no, access consciousness is smaller than phenomenal consciousness. And an example might be that, like, maybe there's a faint buzzing from your computer right now that you're not really, that if you were asked to talk about your own consciousness, you wouldn't really mention the buzzing, but it is informing your experience a little bit, like there in the background, right? And, I broadly say, I think that historically, if we just take that very broadly, we can say humans' access consciousness, the honing of the intrinsic perspective, the development of the intrinsic perspective I'm talking about, is that humanity's, our access consciousness has grown to be almost filling the space of our phenomenal consciousness. We've gotten very good at expressing our own consciousness. We've gotten very good at talking about the emotional states of ourselves, of others, and so on. And so, like, you could broadly call that theory of mind, but it would be a very sort of weird usage compared to the literature. So I sort of just broadly talk about it as like this intrinsic perspective, this ability to really discuss and talk about minds.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing up the access and phenomenon distinction as well. And I think we have the same Karl Popper book that is in your background, and it's right here next to me. That's a good sign. We'll talk about falsifiability if we have time towards the end, because I think one of the most humorous parts of the book, also wittiest parts of the book there. I really loved it. I would like to go through a couple of questions in the Zoom, if that's okay, because they relate to this part of the discussion. Phil first and Claudia next, if that's okay. And then we have, sorry, I don't know your first name, Hoke. There's
I was just commenting. It's not a.
Okay.
I do have a question if you want me to ask one though. But
okay, I will get to
comments are good. Comments are good too. Okay, right? After the questions again.
Good. I love it. So Phil, do you actually wanna read it up and present your question?
Yeah, sure. Haven't finished the book yet, so maybe you touch on a little bit of Buddhism, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like that historical development and how that kind of plays into both the intrinsic and extrinsic perspective, because to me they have, that rich history of kind of exploring all these possible states of consciousness and whatnot.
It's such a it's probably one of the more common questions that I get, and there's a good reason, right? Which is that I basically, and I try to be as explicit as possible about this, and admit how sort of fundamentally ridiculous it is, where I'm just like, I'm basically just going to focus on what is colloquially called like the West, right? So I go through ancient Greece and Rome and so on. It's a very limited view of humanity, like very, very obviously. one thing that I will say that I think is probably true, and that I sort of wish I had touched on, so at least I had said something about it in the book, is that within the West, when science and when the extrinsic and the intrinsic perspective develop, they're very synchronized. And this is something I talk about in the book, right? So they're leaping forward together. So, for example, in ancient Greece, you get the same, you begin to develop science in literally basically the same city that you're also developing literature, right? Around the same generations. So it's very, very tightly sort of correlated, where the intrinsic and extrinsic perspectives begin to get developed. They also fall at around the same time historically, right? So you have the fall of Rome, and this term isn't popular anymore, but the Dark Ages afterwards. And when I was doing this literature review, the sort of the opening thesis that I had was, well, maybe things didn't change too much then, but it's actually find a document from like 700 AD that's like really discussing people's mental states written anywhere in Europe. Like find one. It's really hard. It's really hard to find anything. Versus if you go to ancient Rome, the graffiti alone, right, is like, it's basically just Twitter, right? Like it's all already there. And then again, you see the same thing. When does science really become distinguished as a discipline? I forget when the term scientist is introduced, but it used to be man of science, but they introduced it because women were doing science. So the term scientist is supposed to be a gender neutral term that gets put out historically. Again, I forget exactly when, but there's this very clear moment where we're not a natural philosopher, not a philosopher, we're talking about scientists now. And that's around almost exactly the same time that you're developing literature. I mean, you're really developing the novel, is what I mean by that, right? And I think there's, the novel is effectively the best tool we have for sort of just talking about other minds.
James Burke blamed the fireplace. In Connections, James Burke argues that in the 14th century we changed how we heat houses, and we could be alone, or you could have some kind of privacy that you did not have in the great halls of the 12th century, where there was one central fireplace and everybody gathering around it. And he kind of has this thought experiment in his book. You're talking about how every philosopher is a fabulist. I think the same thing about pop sci writers. I mean, you included it in a bit. And he writes about how you can trace back the history of heating and lighting common spaces, and the development of the private room, the private bedroom, first for the ruler and then for multiple people, and how in the paintings of the time you start seeing the girl with the book alone. And then if you have the market, somebody will be like, let's write books for girls, there's money in it. So you could have a more kind of progress studies capitalist take on this as well.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, I love explanations like that. What's interesting, and just to very broadly summarize the point in trying to answer the question, is just that I don't think it was that synchronous in the rest of the world. In fact, what I think you could probably argue is that in other traditions you see much more of a clear linear development of
Sorry, do you mind repeating, because we lost you for one sentence? Now we lost the audio. This is getting interesting. Now we can see you, but we can't hear you.
This?
Now it's good. I love it when somebody's talking about technology and then technology just fails. When you're in San Francisco and there's no internet, I love that.
Yeah, I'm getting another your internet is unstable warning here. But I would say probably in other parts of the world, you didn't have the same synchronicity. So I think to me, that would be the interesting story. If I were to sort of, broaden the scope of the self-imposed and self-admittedly, historical blinders that I put on, I think the story would be that the synchronization is not as present in other parts of the world. And I don't think one is like good or bad or anything. I just think that that's probably historically the clearest and most interesting thing I can say about that, is that I think that you just don't have this really clear synchronization. You basically get a lot more focus on the intrinsic perspective earlier on, particularly within a lot of different religious texts of the time, and then later, much later, you sort of get science and the extrinsic perspective, but it sort of comes in separately.
It was
Yeah, it seems like
cheaper to think about stuff under a tree.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it also seems like maybe this is like a correlation, but as like the West kind of comes to the limits of the extrinsic perspective in understanding the intrinsic perspective, we kind of like reached out, so to speak, to like, all the Buddhists, and now we're kind of combining science and Buddhism kind of together to, just explore what's there.
Yeah, back at the oh, now I'm going to blank on his name, but there's a very famous neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin who does work with Buddhist monks and looking at what happens, in the brain during meditation and so on. And, I always thought it was a little bit, reductive, right? Because he's like, oh, there's this gamma band increase or something, Well, it's probably a gamma band increase when I watch TV, but okay.
And our friend Alex Criddle, that you give a special thanks to at the end of your book, and who is an Interact host and is just launching a series about breakthroughs, and one of the big breakthrough episodes is going to be about consciousness. He studies Mormonism and psychedelics, so we see some very interesting overlaps.
Working with.
I love this idea of having reached what Phil, you mentioned, like having reached the limits of the extrinsic perspective, or feeling like it, right? Because even the Egyptians, according to Eric, thought that everything had already happened. One of the funniest parts in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, which, by the way, he wrote as a very late bloomer, and he said that it's because he had a marriage crisis in midlife. And he could choose between an extramarital affair with a dancer or writing a novel, and I think he made. I mean, of course, you can argue about this, but I think he did the right thing there. One of the best lines is that William of Baskerville thinks very deeply that the ancients had all the knowledge, and all science is just going downhill from now on, and they just like live out their lives knowing that this is, the ruins of the lost Atlantis, and you read it today, and it's just very, very funny. Claudia, are you here with us?
I am here. I had to switch
yes, hello.
devices. Yeah.
Hey, do you want to? You've said so many amazing things in the chat, and you also asked a couple of questions. Do you want to maybe dive into them or choose?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
what you want?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear perspective on both. I think that we all like, at least a lot of us, I'm sure on this call, realize that language is a limiting factor, particularly in English. We just don't have enough words for things, right? I don't know that many. I don't really know other language, but I know that can be something that I'm just in my mind. And when I was reading the book, just reading about, I was so happy to see a definition of consciousness, but then we talked about Buddhism, like there's so many other languages. Like, is it easier if there's more words and you can sort of, split it apart? And would it be easier to study if it wasn't such a gigantic word, concept all packed into one word? And that's one question. I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts or Eric's thoughts on that. And then the other one was just the one we all keep hearing about, as AI gets more advanced. The big question, is it ever going to be conscious? And like, if you can't study it, and like, your book is really proving that we can't really even prove our own consciousness. I mean, we feel it, right? But would we ever even be able to say, at least now, that something else is conscious? Do we have a definition and a scientific way of measuring it? I mean, that's a real thing that is a question, right? You get down to the soul, you get into religion and like all that good stuff, which I'm not trying to ask at all. I'm really just asking for scientifically. Could you say AI is ever conscious? So those are my questions.
I think especially just to like cover maybe the first quickly and then jump to the second, because I think that there's a huge amount to say about that. And I'm also interested in what anyone else has to say about it as well. When it comes to sort of definitions of consciousness, I'm actually of the opinion that there's a funny sense in which we all very much sort of know what we're talking about when it comes to consciousness. So if I say like your consciousness, like what I mean is like the stream of experiences, that begins when you wake up from a dreamless sleep and you start your day, and effectively, everything that all your senses, everything that you experience throughout the day is all part of your consciousness. And you can sort of point to it, right? In a very broad sense. So I think in terms of and just to sort of back up, my claim that there is a sense in which it's very obvious what everyone's talking about, is that medically, we talk about very broadly levels of consciousness all the time, and we rely on it a great deal, right? So when people have to go under anesthesia, or when you apply the Glasgow Coma Scale to a patient, you have to sort of make very particular ratings about like the level of consciousness, and basically what you're assessing is the presence or absence of this stream, this inner stream, this inner life. But the term has been so sort of broadly abused and used, in every possible way, right? You could talk about the Hegelian consciousness of the age, right? You could talk about consciousness. Some people talk about consciousness and they mean something like self-awareness, right? So, your dog might not be self-aware in that it can't really recognize itself in a mirror, or it doesn't really have this third, meta concept of self. But your dog, if if it hurts its paw, probably feels, pain in terms of its conscious experience, right? So there's a lot of confusion around the terms, and regarding AI, there's now even more confusion because people have started using the term, sentience. They've started using the term, awareness, and so on, as sort of these synonyms. And I think it's very interesting that this relatively esoteric academic field that I entered and have been in now for a long time, or feels like a long time, is now suddenly highly relevant, at least in certain ways, when it comes to AI. I think it's quite reasonable to ask. I mean, there is no other entity on the planet that can convincingly talk about its own consciousness other than humans. You could very easily get GPT-4. I mean, less so now because they installed a bunch of guardrails where they really don't like self-reference, and they really, I am an AI from OpenAI. I do not have consciousness. But before they put those sort of, keyword guardrails in, you could very easily get these large language models to exclaim that they're conscious and talk all about how they're conscious and so on, right? So even if like you're sort of, innately deeply skeptical that these things are, I think they probably are not conscious, which is in one way sort of a horror. But it's certainly now a very relevant and real question. And that's sort of the bar that I present to people, right? It's like, I get their brains are very, their brains, if you can even call an artificial neural network that at all, are very different from us in structure, and they operate in very different ways. It's like, yes, all true. They're also the only other things that can convincingly talk about about consciousness, right? And like express themselves and at least pretend like they have a mind. And so already that sort of puts them in this, this place where you probably should have some questions about it.
Thank you so much, Eric and Claudia. Harris, now that we know your first name.
So I have like a couple questions. The first one, you said you have a very hard time finding literature from, you said around like 700 AD-ish, talking about people's like state of mind, like internal state of mind.
That's not like in a religious context.
Yeah, because that's what I was wondering, because like the Bible talks about that all the time, right?
Well, that's not it does to a certain degree, in the sense that like let me give an example, which is that if you look at like ancient Egyptian poetry or stories, They do occasionally reference internal states, but it's very sparse. And there's one particular tale, which is sort of the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, and on it, basically the hero goes to an island, meets a great beast. And in the Egyptian version of the tale, the emotionality is like not described at all. In the Odyssey, the same thing happens. They meet the Cyclops on the island, and the emotionality is like debatably referenced. Right? They're like afraid. Right? Like there's
even
some sort
just
of
that level of like
even just
such
that
and such
level.
had emotion.
But when you get to Medea, when you get to the founding plays of like literature, you have this really rich. I mean, it feels like a novel, or nowadays maybe we would say like a new golden age TV show, right? Where there's characters with really great depth and so on. And I think it's sort of arguable that the Bible is a bit more in the Homeric domain than it is in sort of the Medea domain, where the language is, mental states are definitely referred to, but there's not like these really deep dives. And that's, again, the thing is too, is that when I'm talking about that within the book, in terms of I spend a couple sentences, this is how like fast things go, right? For something so short and covering so much distance, where I talk about, you can find examples within some religious documents of people talking about mental states. And I give one that's not actually from the Bible. But if you look at just sort of like secular descriptions of people's mental states, like as if that is a thing of interest and that's worth sort of expanding upon, that's very hard. I think you have to go to like, even if you go to like Beowulf and like, some of these other sort of classically non-religious stories, you get something that's quite similar to like Homeric literature, and not at all like Roman poetry or something, which is like obsessed with, Catullus is like obsessed with, his own internal sort of states.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah,
it's not like, oh, there's a word like someone such felt emotion, right? It's sort of like, oh, and then there's this and then there's this, and they're like, it's all that like extended descriptions of the emotion itself. That's kind of what you're
yeah, and it's just like you're absolutely right to point out that, listen, none of this stuff is like, it's not like people lost the ability to completely talk about minds, but I think and showing any of this stuff sort of in a convincing statistical way, I sort of thought about how to do it, right? And then I was like, no. But
I buy it. I totally buy it.
But yeah, I think it's very much just like levels, right? It's sort of like one thing that sort of rises and dips. And you don't, like as I said, like Catullus is basically like Woody Allen in terms of the level of like neuroticism and like self-articulation in terms of his own, streams of consciousness, and so on. And that just goes missing, effectively for a very long time, and then it sort of gets rediscovered. So it's sort of like the A tier stuff vanishes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so that that was just something that popped up. The second thing was about I read that the chapter 4 from your book that Anna, you sent out, and my question is, do you think fMRI as like a technique is at all valuable or could be made to be valuable?
Well, it's always like, if you come to me with some particular fMRI study, right, there are some classics, right? Like there are some classics that have tens of thousands of citations, right? If you come to me with some particular study and we go over the methodology and so on, I might, end up in a position where I say, this was worth publishing. This is like a paper, yes, but if you really zoom out, right, like if you really like zoom out, and I say like, is our understanding, like I think in effect the story of fMRI for a long time now has been, it's more complex than the first fMRI people thought. Like that's sort of like the continuous like that's like where the literature has evolved to now, wherein the most common like blockbuster, thing you can sort of do is just to show, well, actually,
The
there's stuff
default
in the
mode
90s
network is
that
actually
localized it.
two default
Yeah,
mode networks.
exactly. It's like, oh, well, in the 90s we thought it was localized here, but it's actually like, more broadly localized there. And so again, for any like particular like one study, like I'm not gonna go and like take someone's study and be like, this is like complete trash, right?
No, because
like,
there are people who think that fMRI is like completely like bogus. Like they will not read an fMRI study. They like think it's a total waste of time. Some of them are electrophysiologists, but
yeah. No, absolutely. There's definitely some levels of analysis rivalry. But like very broadly, do I think that if you ask me, like, is our understanding of big picture how the brain functions at a cognitive level, not at a molecular level, not at like an individual neuronal level, not at even like an anatomical level, and excluding, very primary sensory cortices stuff. If you ask me, is our understanding of like exactly how cognition works that much better than even before fMRI was introduced? My answer would even just to that question, which includes almost all of neuroscience, would probably be not that much.
like,
not to that
how useful
degree.
is all this stuff to like let's say we only care about cognitive psychology, right? How much is this stuff versus like stopwatches and carefully designed experiments? And your answer is like, yeah, not really that much of a benefit.
I think it's sort of it's sort of, it's the kind of thing that's, yes, it's obviously easy to say, show me the great results, right, and so on. Science is very difficult, and it takes a long time. But I do think that there's something fundamental about neuroscience that makes it very difficult. And if I had to sort of sum it up, very broadly, and why one should be skeptical of things like fMRI results without, picking apart individual studies or individual methodologies. Can you do that? Right? Without doing that, just the fact is that like, imagine doing the equivalent of an fMRI to an artificial neural network. Is that a very interesting thing? Yeah. And the answer is generally no. Like people have tried this. They do like, could a neuroscientist understand a microprocessor? That's one thing I talk about directly in that chapter.
I thought that was that's a great paper, man.
Yeah, it is a really funny paper. And then there's also like, could a neuroscientist understand an artificial neural network, which is like more recent and basically making, similar points to applying the techniques of neuroscience to artificial neural networks, and also coming up like a little bit empty-handed. And so just from like a very broad perspective, it's sort of like, there's this whole field within AI of what's called mechanistic interpretability, which is basically figuring out how it is that the AI is doing what it's doing. And, the broad answer to that right now is that we don't know. It's a black box, right? So that's like the very broad answer. You have some inroads, you might have some favorite thoughts and methods, but like the broad answer and conclusion of that right now is that we don't. So then the sort of question is, well, what would have to be so drastically different about the brain wherein that mystery doesn't apply for some reason for the same problems? And I've just never gotten like a convincing, I'm open to like a really convincing argument that actually the brain should be really mechanistically interpretable, and and all the techniques of neuroscience pick out the spatial temporal layer that's mechanistically interpretable. But I've just never, it's not even like a case that gets made either, right? So that's sort of part of my role, right? I mean, at least now, it's just to be a bit of a gadfly and be like, okay, well, even if I'm wrong, you have to make that case somewhere and sort of tell me why in particular.
I would sorry, let's just because Eric has a hard stop. If we have time, we will come back to Harris. Thank you so much. I really would like to go back to some parts that actually now will beautifully overlap with what you guys just discussed. And I would love, Eric, for you to talk a little bit about the problems with averaging. One of your most famous blog posts of the past months discussed the replication crisis and some people who have revealed some scientific shortcomings there. How is this what would need to be different about the brain for us to have more robust research findings? And how does the problem with averaging and the replication crisis overlap.
Yeah, it's very interesting because we're at this point where there's both, claims about that we can use AI to like read your mind off of brain imaging and so on. And then there's like also, and that would have to involve, presumably that would have to involve like individual trials. Although I think if you look into those, you'll notice that they actually end up involving, averages and stuff like that. But the simple truth is what you learn quickly in neuroscience is that every individual trial. So like you put someone in a brain scan, you show them an image, and you look at their brain, and you image their brain. It's always just a mess. I mean, it's just noise. It doesn't look like anything. And you have to do it sort of over and over and over and over again. And when you do that, you can get very clear signals. I worked in an event-related potentials lab when I was an undergraduate, and so that involves putting electrodes on the scalp and then like averaging across the EEG, and you do see like very clear like patterns. Like you can see, you're like, hey, this looks beautiful. This is a chart. I can put this in a graph and publish a paper about it. But then you look at like any individual time that the individual saw it, and it's just this like crazy noisy line, right? And so there's this question of like, are you really, are you really sort of just averaging out and getting like the real signal, and that's like the real signal, and all that other stuff was noise? Or is it sort of like the real thing is the individual trial and the individual response, and then you can create this statistical entity from averaging across those, but you have to sort of keep in mind that entity is something you've created, right? It's not actually something that occurs in any brain at any time, right? It's sort of this statistical thing that you create, and that's just part of the a fundamental truth about science is that, listen, like science is a job. So science has to proceed. Like you can't just like hit pause and not go out and do papers or whatever. Like you have to do papers. So like when you see the immense attraction to treating things, to treating these these statistical averages, these amalgams as and reifying them as if they're like, this is like the processing that's occurring, right? But no one very rarely goes back and checks, is it the case that say trials that look more like the average response sort of are related to say better behavior or better processing or so on? And the answer is almost always no, even if you do look, and almost no one does look. So again, it's sort of like the reason why I keep my critiques like so broad is that you can bring up any individual paper and say, well, they did this average, and then let's look at the methodologies, and then is it sort of adequate? And in a lot of cases, you're sort of like, yeah, I understand why you did all the stuff that you did, but there's still this broader question of to what degree is neuroscience proceeding in answering like the really big questions? And it's particularly funny because it's often the big questions that people get into the field to answer, right? And then sort of they get sidetracked and lose their way.
And there isn't even a consensus in the field what counts as falsifiable. So how do you measure success? By how many popular science books do you sell? Simon, you had a question in the chat, and thank you so much for your patience. Do you want to read it up? Present it to yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I better look at it again just to make sure. Yeah. I mean, we were talking about levels in the medical context, levels of consciousness, and so I was wondering in sort of where we and then we were talking about what is or what how do you decide if we're conscious or if some being is conscious. So I was wondering in trying to understand what the definition is, if when something doesn't have this self-reflection or some being doesn't have this self-reflection, or perhaps you as a being don't have this self-reflection for some amount of time due to the influence of whatever might be happening. Um, so are you then still conscious, or is it something else, or is it a level of consciousness, or how do we think about this?
Yeah, I think to even before getting into, you know, like some particular coma scale or something like that, I mean, it's a sense of, you know, sometimes when you're sleeping, you dream, right? You can think about that as like a particular level of consciousness and so on. But sometimes you seem to wake up from like a deep dreamless sleep. Like there was nothing, and then you come into being, right? So consciousness is like
Like
the
the
difference
beginning
between
of
those two
Westworld,
states.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I think you and I first, when we first ever met, we discussed Westworld, which was just starting. And we were discussing how every morning the androids wake up and with this completely wiped off brain, like today is going to be great. And they don't remember that yesterday they had all these terrors.
Yeah, it was like horrific.
This is how humans are. Every morning you're like, today is going to be great. And you have no evidence to suggest that that's true.
It actually is true that sleep is really important for like emotional regulation too. And sometimes I wonder if that's just like, it's just literally like, okay, another chance. Like it's not even anything like physiological. You're just like, okay,
yeah, and also like
take 5,000.
And it changes your identity. Like there are interviews with insomniacs who don't want to fall asleep because they don't want to lose today's you. Like you get attached to today's you today, and then you don't know who you will be tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe that's why no toddler wants to sleep. Right? They understand. They're like, no, don't make me go. But like regardless, I think you know it's sort of like consciousness. We can just think of it as it's like maintaining your consciousness, your constant stream of experiences is sort of like the main function of your brain. I mean, at least that it seems very likely that that's the case. And that's not popularly considered the target of neuroscience. That's what's very strange. I mean, you can go back and you can look at like, you know, people will do things like they'll put people in brain scanners and then they won't present them any stimuli, right? And then they're like, did you know that there's still stuff happening in the person's brain, right? This is the resting state network. Like, have you ever
women it's like
this,
this, right? And for men it's like this.
Like call up nature, you know, call up science. You know, there's something happening here when we don't present these people with stimuli. It's like, well, yeah, like any human could just introspect and be like, yes, I sort of am constantly experiencing and thinking things. This is the subject of literature, right? You know, it's really completely unsurprising that there would be something going on in your brain. In fact, there was just a recent interesting paper, I think, again, maybe in science, maybe in Nature, this summer, showing that, you know, the resting state, which is probably, you know, basically just your stream of consciousness, sort of looks almost like a turning hurricane, right? Like it has like almost this like turning dynamics in terms of like how the information is flowing, right? So it's like this cycle, and that, right, that's the sort of thing you could almost like introspect and like arrive at. You know, it's like there's something going on, new stimuli comes in and arrives, and so I think that there's almost like this like basic common sense like introspection stuff that has been missing from neuroscience, and has led neuroscience to make some sort of embarrassing, you know, like this is revelatory claims when it's like obviously not revelatory. And I think part of that is just like missing this really, what I think is a really basic fact, which is that the main purpose of the brain is to you know, execute your stream of consciousness. Like that's because that's how you feel, right? It's like you wake up, you experience stuff. It sort of determines your day. You think, I'm going to go get coffee. I'm going to go do this, right? Animals seem to act like they have a stream of consciousness, and their whole behavior plays off of that. And then with neuroscience, just due to sort of historical factors and how difficult consciousness is to deal with scientifically, we're sort of not allowed to talk about it. And I think much to its detriment.
Thank you so much. Do you have we have 1 minute left. Do you want to take one last question?
Yeah. I have yeah.
When your kids arrive, you just tell us, Laurie. And then Phil, who has already asked a question, also asked something very interesting. which might be a separate salon, but we might leave you with this homework, Eric, at the end. The longest
Sounds good.
question. Laurie, the floor is yours.
So I have a question, but I have first a quick story about why I'm asking the question. It's real short. So I used to live in Arizona, and there's obviously snakes there. And I was walking out the door one day with my dog. It's kind of evening, so light wasn't, the sun was going down, not a whole lot of light. We were walking out the front door, and all of a sudden we were both turning around and walking back inside. And my conscious mind was like, why am I doing this? And it turns out after a few seconds, I turned around, there was like a 4-foot rattlesnake just, a couple feet in front of us. And so I'm wondering, so maybe this is like a question. I don't know if this is like a really simple question, but when we're talking about consciousness, are we talking about subconsciousness as well? Because I didn't perceive that snake. I didn't have a thought, oh, danger, I better go back inside. So, yeah, so for me, I'm trying to figure out when we're talking about it, what fits into this category of consciousness, and where does the subconscious part of our minds come in? And that's kind of connecting to the Buddhism stuff too. Like part of meditating is to have more of an awareness of what's underneath the surface, right? There's always like that iceberg, tip of the iceberg kind of thing that they used to talk about it. So if you could just say whatever you can say about, it's such a curious thing that our minds do that.
Yeah, and another example would be sometimes you're driving somewhere and it's like you sort of come back to the road, and driving is relatively complicated, right? Recognizing a rattlesnake is relatively complicated. But so, the way that I would frame it is something like, you weren't conscious of the snake. You had some sort of unconscious processing that occurred, and then you later realize, and it sort of came into your consciousness. But I think that lots of examples like that there's a lot of hay made about them within neuroscience, and there has been for a long time, wherein people find that, okay, you're not, you're sort of attentionally blind to certain things, and maybe we can just there's some famous examples where people will have a gorilla walk through a video and a lot of people don't even notice it, and so on. So there's sort of this canonical sort of minimization of consciousness. But the simple fact is that if you look through the literature, it's very difficult to find really clear examples of the brain doing very complex things non-consciously. There's some instances that we can say, but there's some, and even those cases are often very debatable, right? So they'll be somebody, very famous case, somebody murdered their wife or some relative in their sleep, and they claim, well, they were sleepwalking and unconscious, during it, right? But it's well, they, of course they claim that, right? Most of the time, it seems as if we really need to be conscious and aware to do anything complex, and that probably even includes the snake example, because you think about it, like in your stream of consciousness, right? You sort of have the current awareness of your surroundings, like the fact that you're going outside, right? So you were certainly aware that you were now outside, right? So then my question would be, could your unconscious processes have detected the snake if you were inside, or are they keying off of the information that they have from your stream of consciousness? And I think probably they're keying off of that. So you can think of consciousness as basically this main function that the brain is doing, and then you have all these subsystems and modules and unconscious processing that's sort of supporting it and doing stuff with that. So that's sort of the distinction that I go with, and I think that's a really important one, because I think we should be wary that we're going to automatically downweigh consciousness because we don't want to have to deal with it from a scientific or metaphysical perspective, right? We're like, this thing is so problematic. If Daniel Dennett called science a universal acid, consciousness is the opposite, right? It's the second you sort of start thinking about it, you're like, well, wait a minute, the whole thing can't work. It can't all just be billiard balls. It can't all just, right? So it's sort of this opposite. And so the second you introduce it, you often end up in a very radical place. And so I think that there's been this natural inclination to downplay its importance, right? And I think it's probably the most important thing that the brain does.
That's amazing. That was like the most beautiful ending, I think, to this wonderful salon. The homework from Phil is probably we won't have time for this, correct? But how would you balance theory building versus the empirical work? So you mentioned in the book that there are basically two schools, two kind of instinctive responses to the mystery. And maybe that's just like, there are two kinds of people. And, we would at some point love to hear, maybe one thing that you can share, if you have it off the top of your head, like maybe a person that we should read who you think balances theory and empiricism.
A great example of this would be somebody like Anil Seth. I think he's both, he's a prominent neuroscientist in the UK. He's very sensitive to both theory arguments and does work on that side, but he also does like really good, solid empirical work. I unfortunately am fully afflicted by the theory bug. I think one day there's just going to be just some jaw-dropping paper. Maybe I'll be alive when it comes out. Probably not. But maybe my kids will read it or so on, right? Like it'll come out probably. I think at some point, at least I think it's a possibility that such a paper comes out, and it'll be like a patent clerk or something. It'll be that level of like, who's this weird graduate student, from this like B tier university or something, right? And it'll just be explain why it is that the dynamics of the brain necessarily engender subjectivity, right? That would be the ideal case. So. Anyways,
so we're
I'm
waiting for the Einstein of neuroscience, basically.
Yes.
Well, that's a really good note, and I think a positive and empowering note to land on. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us, and congratulations on the book. Guys, read The World Behind the World and Eric's novel, The Revelations. Tell people about these books. I think they are some of the most sophisticated things I've ever read on this very, very complicated thing. And in a very kind of humble way. To me, it's positive when somebody says, oh, I realized that the universe is unknowable. I think it's a phase, but to me, it's encouraging. Thank you so much. And, we will do this every time you do a book. So we can't wait for the next one.
Yeah.
And also follow Eric on Substack, The Intrinsic Perspective, easy to remember after this salon. Very interesting podcast, one with me, and a lot of great essays every week. Thank you so much, Eric. And guys, amazing questions. Sorry that we didn't have time for more. I know that Eric, you're very active on Twitter, so I'm sure that if you tweet or DM Eric, he will be able to get back to you. See you soon, guys, at another salon. This was an absolute joy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciated talking to you, and thanks so much for coming.
Absolutely. Wonderful attendees. Thank you so much, guys. Take care. Bye-bye. Welcome, everybody, to this Intrinsic Super Salon that I'm extremely excited about, because our special guest tonight is a very good friend of mine, Eric Hoel. I kept feeling, as I was reading your new book, that you need some kind of extra added letter in your name. It's too casual. Eric Hoel, for this kind of work, you need to be like Eric P. Hoel or something. Have you ever thought about adding a non-specific extra letter?
In fact, yes. My middle name is Parker. So that would work perfectly. But yet, as a high school friend of mine pointed out very early on, my name is often mispronounced Hole. So Eric P. Hole is probably not the best sign off for an author. So I've avoided the middle initial ever since he so lovingly pointed that out. I thought that was just a really nice thing for him to immediately think of and jump to. And I was so traumatized that I've avoided it ever since. But thank you, because some of my favorite authors have like the very non-casual name.
Absolutely. But you have time. You're still very disturbingly young for writing such books. So after The Revelations, which I like to call, as you know, and maybe you don't like this, a road movie inside a mind, that was also somehow mysteriously and deeply influenced and inspired by Kierkegaard. You came out with this nonfiction book that, if I'm not mistaken, you simultaneously wrote, or at least with a big overlap with your fiction book, The World
Yeah.
Behind the World,
it
just out of
wasn't-
Simon and Schuster.
It wasn't exactly overlapping, and I think that that's just because it is just fundamentally true that nonfiction is easier than fiction. If anyone tells you the opposite, they're just not a good fiction writer. Like, fiction is really hard. Fiction books like attack you back in ways that nonfiction books don't. Right, so you're sort of in some sort of like deeper Promethean struggle when you're doing fiction. And like nonfiction, I think that can exist when you're like really trying to say, like, come up with like a new scientific theory or something, right? But like in general, I think nonfiction is just a little bit easier because it's often it's so much more concrete, and you aren't like fighting an adversary as you go along. So like the fiction book took me, essentially 10 years, and this nonfiction book took me, essentially like a year or 2 years of writing. And I think that just sort of holds generally. I don't really trust anyone who says the opposite, because I think every fiction writer knows what it is to have your book sort of fight you back, and then for you to feel like totally lost, and like, how are you going to actually put everything together where the pacing makes sense and so on.
And that's very well aligned with the message of this book, right? Like, there's the extrinsic genre of the nonfiction, and as you described the novel toward the middle of the book, as being the ultimate intrinsic technology, where you even solve the problem of the other minds. I want to talk to you a little bit about this, what you call the epistemological hybrid zone. You talk about your upbringing, which you, like, it was some kind of 1940s family movie you spent in your mother's independent bookstore, and you devoured not just fiction books, but also, after a while, scientific books. But you do exist between these two worlds. And everything in your book is about dualism. You own up to it in the opening sentence of the book. Do you maybe want to talk a little bit about this epistemological liminal zone that you seem to have been inhabiting since day one of Eric Howell, and how did that lead you to writing this book, which I hear was very easy? Guys, write a great nonfiction book tomorrow.
It's such a good question, and let me problematize it though, like, slightly, in that, I think ultimately what you'll find is that, if you go to like sell a company or do anything else, you'll find an incredibly pat correlation between, what exactly happened in the CEO's life and then the exact sort of company that they were, that they're doing now, right? And no one's ever just like, I just started this business because I liked it, or I thought it was interesting, right? Everyone sort of has to have like a personal story. And I think there's a deep sense in which like intellectuals are not immune to this sort of self mythology that can sort of creep in. I think there is a deep sense in which I was always interested in consciousness from the fact that I grew up in a bookstore, and I love fiction, and I always thought I would be a fiction author. And I really didn't think I would do anything else. And then I found science, and I was good, and I found that I was sort of good at it. Like the professors seemed to like what I was saying, and I had like a good rapport with them, and it seemed like, this could actually be something that I could go out and do. And I looked around within the scientific field, and I thought, what are my strengths? Well, I'm not like the best mathematician in the world. Like, I have some papers that are almost like pure math, but I'll be the first to say that I'm not actually very good, mathematician. Like, if I wanted to go and like make a contribution to string theory, I think that that's probably fundamentally beyond me.
Although I remember the first time I ever corresponded with you via post, I remember this particularly because what your address was, because your address at Princeton was 1 Einstein Drive. So are you maybe being a little bit too modest here? Maybe your
Well,
concept of that not being good at math and
well,
mine are maybe very different here.
yeah. This is spoken from a sort of a ridiculous vantage. But like but I thought within the field of consciousness research, it seemed like there were some really big open questions in science, and consciousness I thought was one of them. It seemed like very unknown, like very open, and so it seemed like a place where, you know, maybe I could sort of be a little bit more creative, and where being like interdisciplinary and having lots of interests would actually be something relevant, versus, you know, if you're just doing string theory, there's really nothing that's relevant beyond string theory, right? You know, some other parts of physics, right? That's and some math, right? But within, you know, something like consciousness research, it seems like it could draw on, you know, all sorts of different domains. And so there's one story in which, you know, I'm sort of like continuously interested in consciousness, you know, from a very early age. And then there's sort of like another story, which is that, you know, in a sense, becoming a scientist was like a practical matter, wherein I thought, well, this seems like a fun, interesting career, and I think I could do it. And so and maybe I could like support myself as I write books. Because of course I knew that would be a problem. Growing up in a bookstore, you know, you meet a lot of authors who would come by for talks, and, you know, the number of authors who actually, you know, fully support, you know, like, or say fully support a family, like let alone even just themselves, right? But like, imagine, you know, but can really contribute to a household from just selling writing is very low. It's very low. You generally are a writing professor. So anyways, that's just to sort of put like a more like materialistic like spin on the more like traditional like self mythology, but this probably like all of it's true, you know, to a certain extent. But anyways, I loved writing this book because it was stuff that I had been thinking about for 10 years. So when I say I sort of found it easy, right? You know, it's specifically because I went out, I got my PhD working with essentially the top US lab that was doing scientific research into consciousness, and working on some of the leading theories. And so this epistemological hybrid zone that you brought up, you know, when you're working on like the very cutting edge of science, so that's so like at the edge that you don't even know if what you're doing is at all correct, right? Like, people say, oh, you worked at the cutting edge of science. It sounds so like romantic and like nice. Yeah. But like the problem with the cutting edge of science is that you can like waste your life, right? I mean, there's a very real possibility when you're sort of like out on the edge. You don't know if what you're doing is going to actually end up being real, if it is actually going to end up being useful. So
it's kind of weird note to have somebody who basically chooses science as other people choose a day job. Like, oh, I'm going to do this simple little matter that I just somehow I'm just good at it, and then this will support me writing my books. And then even within that, you kind of gravitate towards the more cutting edge fringe stuff, right?
Yeah,
because you work
a foolish decision, right?
I was very impressed by how you actually, you kind of cover that era in your life in your novel, The Revelations, but you also go back to the birth of the integrated information theory and your work with Tononi. And this is basically, you know, in startups, you know, it's not, startups are not just autobiographical, but they are basically driving a car whilst assembling it. And I feel that when you're working on the fringes of science in a successful and productive and constructive way and not wasting your life, you must have felt a little bit like that with every paper. I mean, you know, we discussed Friston, we discussed emergence, you wrote beautifully about, you know, when the map is better than the territory, et cetera, like basically, like with AI research in the past 10 years, it's the actual live papers that are creating the field.
Yeah, and I think there's also a sense in which this book is, and you know, it's fundamentally in a way a pessimistic book. And that's from having spent, you know, so much time deep in the weeds at this very edge of science. I say at some point in the book that, you know, you know, when I entered science, I thought that the universe was knowable, and now at the end of an education, I think the universe is unknowable. And I've really become much more sort of a skeptic, not just of sort of not just of sort of like methodological aspects of science, right? Like any science you can take and you can critique, you know, some various, you know, overhyped aspect of it, or its methodology, or, you know, so on. And some of that's really interesting, and some of that's like really trivial, like it's stuff that ends up getting self-corrected and washed out, and it's just really not a problem. But when it comes to, you know, understanding consciousness, this is something that has been being attempted for a very long time, and we sort of don't currently have a very good scientific theory, and we have some inklings of what maybe sort of semi-satisfactory scientific theories might look like, but they're never fully satisfactory. And I think that probably indicates something really significant. Like I don't think that that's just it. I don't think it's just like sort of this weird coincidence that this one part of science lags so much the other aspects of science as they race ahead, right? It would be sort of a very strange scenario wherein it's just this like statistical process where some fields make a lot of progress and some fields, you know, don't. And I don't know if it has too much to do with, you know, the complexity. Like we have science of very, very complex things. And, you know, you could make an argument that it is just due to the complexity. I think that that's probably the best argument that you can sort of make, is just to say, listen, we're dealing with this, you know, massive parameter system, which is the human brain. It's extremely complex, right? But you sort of have to do a lot of work with that argument. So in a way, you know, this is like a rare sort of pessimistic, you know, popular science book, in that, you know, a lot of you know, scientific books are sort of you know, rah rah rah, look how far we've come, and this one is a bit more sort of like reflective. I don't know if that's like a good thing, or if that's like a deeply attractive thesis in the current world, but it's an honest reflection. And I kind of hope that I made it like an interesting pessimism, right? It's like you can offer forward some form of pessimism, right? But then you have to make it interesting. So to me, that was actually the biggest challenge of the book, is getting
Did you feel a responsibility
points.
to be upbeat? Did you feel that there's a, like, you know, every nonfiction book these days has to be aspirational? Did you feel in some ways that that was not the case?
Yeah, and you can't, I mean, you know, if you go on Amazon, right, and you look at like the even like the description, you know, that the publisher wrote of the book, it's like some, you know, you know, it's like discover the mystery of consciousness and discover like the, right, I forget exactly what it is, but it's just sort of the copy that they write, you know, for all popular science books, right? And I can't, you know, I can't control that. they have all the power in the relationship, right? You know, these big publishers. So yeah, like it's almost like it's almost like impossible to even communicate to even the people who publish nonfiction books, you know, that, hey, you could actually say something interesting that's not like, here's my individual pet theory that I'm gonna go, you know, promote the heck out of, or like, hey guys, did you know about brain imaging? You know, we got it all figured out, right? Like just like getting anything else through is very difficult, and sort of relies on you being like, yes, my book definitely fits that frame, and then just writing, you know, whatever you're gonna write. and then it's, you know, it's too late.
You're saying that, because for me it did not, I felt very empowered reading it, and I think you treat, you know, the ancient sources, even, you know, instances where the translations might be very, you know, very, very different one from the other, with a lot of respect, and you kind of like go against opinions that say that, you know, our ancestors were these dumb automatons, and at some point, you know, the bicameral mind just started overlapping. The Venn diagram happened, and now we're very smart. And you are also you seem very open-minded about the question of free will. You kind of go there via your notes on emergence. So, you know, we know a lot, and you actually talk about fatalism, right? And you know that my critique about certain popular science writers these days tends to be about my issues with people being overly deterministic or fatalist, or have a fatalist or defeatist notion about the world. I really would like to stop for a second before we really dive into what might be wrong with neuroscience and what we can do about it, just to give the room a chance to ask any questions about this very interesting background that Eric arrives to non-fiction writing too. And if you want to share any stories from your life where you felt that your artistic instincts and your scientific ambitions or abilities clashed or even supported each other. This is your moment. Anybody here working on an artistic project these days?
I love hearing about science and as it combines with art. This is one of the things that my wife used to do. She was a gallery artist in New York City, and she ran an organization called SciArt, and she makes sculpture about science. And so I sort of love artistic takes on science. So yeah, so it's just to support anyone who actually has one.
That's an amazing job. Talk about creating your own job, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, what's interesting with science and art is just that like when you put them together, I think what's interesting is that you always have to like have the art be dominant. So it's like it's a very like common mistake to sort of like mix the two, and then you let the science be dominant, because science is like very fundamentally dominant as an epistemic force, right? Like science is this huge person, you know, wearing a t-shirt that says capital T truth, who sort of bullies, you know, everyone around them. And that's like good, right? In a lot of circumstances, that's like really good. But if you put like too much science in a novel, or you put too much science, you know, in an art piece, it can really it can really sort of overwhelm it in the wrong way. So, you know, it requires a bit of a subtle touch.
Do you have a favorite? I think we probably discussed Asimov at some point, but do you have role models when it comes to scientists who are also artists, other than your wife? Especially I'm thinking about writers and novelists who come from a scientific angle.
Thank you for mentioning her and saving me. I was racking my brain for authors. You know, I think that I have people who I really like who are academics and also artists. Not so many scientists. I think it's really, really rare. I mean, it's very hard to name even one. Like maybe like C.P. Snow, you could go back to. I don't know if I would say that I'm like a huge C.P. Snow fan. I think I read some of his fiction. I thought it was, you know, like good. An example I think of someone who was amazing as both an academic and an artist would be like Umberto Eco. And there's a few other essentially Italian names, you know, who sort